Out in the Atlantic, they're all going to bring spells of rain across the UK. One is clearing away, leaving us, as I say, with a brighter day, but still plenty of showers around over the Midlands and eastern England. Some pretty lively downpours this afternoon. A heavy shower is likely in a few places. Parts of Scotland seeing a scattering of showers. Much of Wales and southwest England will stay dry. Not too many showers here, and we see more persistent rain moving into Northern Ireland by the end of the afternoon. Pretty mild temperatures, mostly getting into the teens when the sun is shining. We could get up to 16 Celsius, but the breeze will be picking up as we go through the day, and it's going to get windy overnight, and not just windy, wet. That rain for Northern Ireland this afternoon spreads to most areas before midnight. Some quite heavy bursts of rain in the west, and the winds will get very gusty, particularly in western Scotland, come first thing on Wednesday morning. It'll be another pretty mild night, with some towns and cities in the south staying in double figures. A fairly damp start then across East Anglia and the southeast to Wednesday morning. A very windy start in western Scotland, blustery conditions here, and those gusty winds will spread across northern Scotland with plenty of heavy showers through the day. We'll see some showers developing across parts of Wales and western England, and they'll spread further east come the afternoon. But again, many places actually seeing decent spells of sunshine, but it will be a windy day. Still pretty mild, double figures, maybe 15, 16 across the southeast, but feeling colder with the winds. The winds will ease a touch through Wednesday evening, but further bands of heavy showers coming in from the west, and that sets us up really for the rest of the working week, with further spells of showery rain zipping across the country on blustery winds, staying pretty mild as well, but there are some signs of colder conditions spreading south this weekend.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216,
Freeview Channel 236,
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio,
with the GB News app, and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway...
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
It's 12 noon. A very good afternoon to you. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this very busy Tuesday lunchtime. Boris holds his hands up. Yes, I did mislead the Commons over partygate, he says, but it wasn't intentional or reckless. Will his defence be enough to save his political career as he faces a parliamentary grilling? Breaking news also from Westminster in the past few minutes. The Tory European Research Group, the ERG, has described the Stormont break with the Windsor framework as practically useless. That's their judgment, but will not say yet whether its MPs will vote against that agreement in the Commons tomorrow. We'll have the latest live from Westminster. Also, where now for the Met after today's damning report finding misogyny, racism and homophobia in the force? The Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, says they're not institutional problems. But the report's author, Baroness Casey, says there needs to be a new approach. So who will now police the police? Home Secretary Suella Braverman, due to make a statement to the Commons shortly, will be there live. And will Donald be in the dock? Police in New York and Washington, D.C. on high alert in anticipation of protests as the former president faces possible criminal charges. Trump's accused of paying related hush money to an adult film actress, Stormy Daniels. We'll have the latest from the States. And don't forget to bring us your views on all those stories, gbviews at gbnews.uk. But first, all those latest headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 1 minute past 12. Boris Johnson says he accepts he misled Parliament over whether lockdown rules had been broken in number 10, but is adamant he did not do so intentionally. Giving evidence to the Privileges Committee, the former Prime Minister said the gatherings in Downing Street should never have happened, but he added the statements he made to the House of Commons were in good faith. Mr Johnson has also described allegations by the committee that it was reckless of him to rely on assurances he received from advisers as unprecedented and absurd. A scathing report into Britain's largest police force has found it to be institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. Baroness Louise Casey led the review into the Metropolitan Police. She's warning victims have been let down and that officers who abuse their power have shattered public trust. The report found the Met's current ethics standards and disciplinary procedures have failed abysmally, and Baroness Casey is calling for a complete overhaul.
The moment that Sarah Everard was raped, abducted, raped and then murdered by a serving police officer, I find it extraordinary that in policing and in the Met Police, that wasn't their moment of like a plane falling out of the sky. I just think it is so dreadful. Change didn't come. So now this report has to carry that and has to take responsibility for getting the change needed.
Shadow Policing Minister Sarah Jones says Labour is calling for new mandatory national standards.
The facts are there for all to see. Whatever you call it, there is institutional racism and misogyny in the police force. We have let down women, we are letting down Londoners, and we are letting down the good police officers who are trying to do their job but are really stymied by lack of resources. So there is a role there for the Met, of course, but there is also a role for government. We need national standards that are mandatory on vetting and misconduct.
Former Detective Superintendent Shabnam Chowdhury told GB News she's appalled by the findings. She admits her career was tarnished after becoming a whistleblower and says officers should be able to speak out without fear of punishment.
When you're a whistleblower and you try to speak out, you very, very quickly find yourself isolated, you find yourself being victimised, you find yourself being intimidated by officers, you find your ranks being closed around you. There's an inability by leaders within the organisation, managers, to fail to actually deal with these issues because they're too scared of their own career progression.
The Transport Secretary is calling on the RMT to give its members a vote on the latest pay offer from rail operators, so next week's strikes can be called off. It's after members of the union who work for Network Rail accepted a similar pay rise of between 9.2 and 14.4%. Industrial action is planned by the RMT for next Thursday and Saturday, but Mark Harper is urging them to call it off.
Network Rail can now get on with delivering reform
to how they deliver maintenance and how they run the infrastructure on the railways. That's halfway done. I think the next stage is that I want the RMT to put what is broadly the same fair and reasonable offer to their members that work for the train operating companies and call off next week's strike. So I think that would be fantastic news for the travelling public if their members, if the RMT members get the chance to consider that pay offer as well for those that work on the train companies themselves.
The Kremlin says Presidents Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have discussed China's peace plan for Ukraine during their first day of talks in Moscow. It's understood the 12-point paper calls for a de-escalation of the war and an eventual ceasefire. President Putin said he carefully studied China's ideas and viewed them with respect. The pair will meet for a second day of talks later. Damage caused by potholes has forced almost 2.7 million cars off the road in the past year. New research by the Asphalt Industry Alliance says one pothole is currently filled on our roads every 22 seconds. But local authority highways teams in England and Wales only received 2/3 of the money they needed to prevent further deterioration last year. The Alliance says almost £14 billion is now needed to fix the backlog of carriageway repairs. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
So welcome back to GB News Live with this breaking news, with Boris Johnson appearing to hold his hands up, admitting that he had indeed misled the House of Commons, but the key saying it was not intentional or reckless. We have the introduction here of what he will be telling the Commons Privileges Committee tomorrow in terms of his defence. Let's just take you through some of the key details very quickly, saying that the revelations, he said, in Sue Gray's report had shocked the public, but they shocked me, he said. It is now clear that over a number of days there were gatherings at Number 10 that, however they began, went past the point where they could be said to have been reasonably necessary for work purposes. That should never have happened, he said, and it fills me with sadness and regret that it did. Going on to paragraph 4, what he will be telling the Privileges Committee: I accept that the House of Commons was misled by my statements, that the rules and guidance had been followed completely at Number 10. This is the key point. But when the statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. I did not intentionally or recklessly mislead the House on 1st December 2021, 8th December 2021, or on any other date. I would never have dreamed of doing so, said Mr Johnson. Well, let's get more now with Olivia Utley, our political reporter, who's at Westminster. And Olivia, the key two words there, and we explain why now, reckless or intentional, because that is what the committee will be looking at in terms of the severity, if you like, of misleading Parliament.
Absolutely, and Boris Johnson has admitted here that he misled the House. Well, he'd sort of admitted that already in setting the record straight. But the case that he lays out in this 60-page dossier, which has just been released, is essentially that it was an accident. And the case rests on a number of details. One is that he claims that it wasn't obvious, that he thinks that the committee is trying to build a case that it was obvious that he misled the House, even if he was advised by his advisors that there was nothing misleading about what he was saying. He should have known, because when you look at those photos, you can see that a party is happening. Now, in the report, he says that it's not obvious. Why, if it was obvious that he was having a party, would there have been an official Number 10 photographer there taking photographs at all? And he points out that there are lots of other people at those gatherings. If it should have been obvious to him, then shouldn't it have been obvious to them as well? Now, you mentioned that point about recklessly or misleading. Well, that's another very important point that Boris Johnson makes in his dossier. Essentially, what he argues is that this committee has behaved badly, that it's gone beyond the scope of what it was supposed to be doing. And he believes it's done that in two ways. One is that it was supposed to be looking into whether he broke the law, whether he broke the regulations, and instead it's looked into whether he broke the guidance. And the other, perhaps more important one, is that it is supposed to be establishing whether or not he intentionally misled Parliament, lied to Parliament. Now, lying to Parliament is a swinging offence, as it were. You can't get around lying to Parliament. You will lose your seat in Parliament. But the committee has lowered the bar, as it were. It's moved the goalposts. It's changed from intentionally misleading. The words that it's now using are intentionally or recklessly misleading. And the point that Boris Johnson makes in this dossier is that recklessly has no precedent in these committees. If you recklessly misled the House, what is that supposed to mean? Is that the same as lying? Is that tantamount to lying? It's not completely clear. And the final point of his defence, which we knew was coming, and it's laid out here, is that he believes that the committee was biased and that it prejudged prejudged his guilt, essentially, before they even started speaking. And that rests on these tweets that Harriet Harman, the chair of the committee, tweeted out last year, saying that Boris Johnson knowingly lied. Well, if she believed he knowingly lied last year, then he believes that she will have gone into this committee with a prejudged opinion. There were essentially no bombshells in this dossier, just quite a lot of evidence that his advisors were telling him that he was speaking the truth when he spoke to Parliament. And ultimately, that's what his defence will rest on.
Yeah, and we understand that the WhatsApp messages, advice from his Director of Communications, may be actually put in front of the committee in terms of advice for workplace exemption in particular. But then, of course, the problem is if he's trying to argue that this was accidental, how could that be accidental when he was obviously given advice? And we wonder how involved the defence is going to be from the barrister Lord Panic KC in terms of what the Prime Minister should or shouldn't have known when he himself has said, "It is, of course, true that my statements to Parliament that the rules and guidance have been followed at all times did not turn out to be correct. And I take this opportunity to apologise to the House for that." So clearly it may be more of a plea of mitigation, might one say?
Well, yeah, so his argument is essentially that the guidance that was given to him was wrong. Now, there are Whitehall sources who don't like that. They say that the guidance he was given was correct, but he then went off-piste in Parliament and went further than his advisors told him. Then that other argument, whether or not it should have been obvious to him, well, his defence, as is laid out in this dossier, is that he was the Prime Minister, he was working day and night in the middle of a pandemic, and he didn't have time, essentially, paraphrasing, but he didn't have time to study the rules and guidance. He had to rely on what his advisors were telling him. And if his advisors gave him the wrong advice, then that's not his fault. He relayed it to Parliament, and in doing so, he accidentally misled the House.
Yeah.
But whether that will fly in the committee is definitely another matter.
And just to explain to our viewers and listeners, I mean, the importance of this defence is, of course, that if the committee finds against him, the sanction could be that he effectively loses his seat and is out of politics. And therefore, we have Rishi Sunak indicating that MPs, when they come to vote on any sanction, will have what's called a free vote.
Yeah, so it's important to understand the process after this report is finally published tomorrow. The committee who published the report will recommend to the House whether Boris Johnson should whether they should vote to suspend Boris Johnson or not. The House of Commons will then get a free vote, as it's called, so they won't be whipped either way. The Prime Minister won't tell Conservative MPs which way to vote on whether or not to suspend Boris Johnson. And if MPs choose to vote to suspend Boris Johnson, well, there's still another phase of the process. The decision would then go out to the people of the constituency of Uxbridge, Boris Johnson's constituency. And if 10%, now that's quite a small number given that Boris Johnson's majority in Uxbridge is only 7,000, if 10% of them decide to get rid of Boris Johnson, then Boris loses his seat in Parliament. So it's quite a lengthy process for Boris Johnson actually to be out of politics altogether. But if that committee make that step tomorrow of advising the House to suspend him, then you can imagine how it gets to a point point where quite a lot of Conservative MPs will, and Labour MPs of course too, will vote to suspend him. And it's very interesting because it's likely that there'd be a split in the cabinet, which would give Rishi Sunak a real headache. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, has already intimated that she would back Boris Johnson. So Rishi Sunak's got a bit of a difficulty on his hands. You could say it's a lose-lose situation for him.
That's going to be a really busy afternoon for you down there. You won't need any warning on that because we've got Suella Braverman, I think, reacting to this report on the Met Police shortly. But also we've got the ERG, the Eurosceptic group of the Tory party, reacting to this Windsor framework ahead of the vote tomorrow on the negotiations in terms of the Northern Ireland trade agreements. They come out with this assessment with the so-called Star Chamber of legal experts. The Stormont break is practically useless, but they're not indicating which way they're going to vote tomorrow.
No, essentially the ERG have decided that they're not going to decide yet. So Mark Francois has said that it's practically useless. They clearly don't much like the Windsor framework, but they haven't actually come out and said that they will vote against it. That might imply that there are splits within the ERG or that there are going to be a number of Conservative MPs abstaining over it. But yes, we were expecting a decision either way from the ERG, and we haven't got one yet.
Olivia, for the moment, thank you. But I suspect there'll be quite a bit more from Westminster this afternoon as it progresses. Thank you very much indeed. We were just talking there about the Met Police report. Well, that damning report into the Met found institutional misogyny, homophobia and sexism at the heart of the force. It was commissioned after the abduction and murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer. Well, it details more stories of cover-ups and sexual assaults. 12% of women in the Met itself saying they had been harassed or attacked at work. The report's author, Baroness Casey, saying the force now needs a complete overhaul. But the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, already rejecting the charge that the problems are, quote, institutional. Let's get more with our national reporter, Ellie Costello, who's outside New Scotland Yard. And, Ellie, now this sort of existential question now, who polices the Met Police, with Sir Mark already indicating he does not believe these things are institutional.
Yes, absolutely, Mark. Good afternoon to you. This is a truly blistering report into the state of the Metropolitan Police. It's found it to be institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic. I have a copy of it here in full, 363 pages from Baroness Casey. That was released this morning, and it includes instances in the Metropolitan Police where evidence was lost in a fridge, which was broken, which meant that cases of alleged rape were dropped. Just some of the findings in this report. It also found sexual harassment and discrimination to be rife within the ranks. There was a Muslim police officer who found pork in his shoes. The case goes on. Well, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, we are expecting her to speak in Parliament a little bit later about the findings of this report, but she did release a statement this morning saying it was clear that there had been serious failings within the Met, and she would be holding the Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, to account to ensure that the changes that are so desperately needed will be implemented. She says in the meantime, further unacceptable cases will come to light. But she does say she has faith in Sir Mark Rowley's leadership. She's confident in his leadership that those changes will be made for policing across London. But as you say, very interesting words from the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, this morning, who says he doesn't want to agree, he doesn't want to use the word institutional when we're talking about sexism, racism within the ranks of the Metropolitan Police. He wants to call it systemic instead. And there has been criticism, including from black organisations and charities, some of which are behind me right now, who say, how is the Metropolitan Police going to be fixed? How are things going to be changed? How are the issues going to be reversed if we are not accepting fully of the issues at the heart of the Metropolitan Police? That's what they're telling me here today.
Yeah, and as you say, we are expecting the Home Secretary to react to this shortly in the Commons, but I think we've also got the London Assembly meeting tomorrow to question both Baroness Casey and Sir Mark Rowley. And just looking at what she said in terms of the Met Police's standing, long in hubris, quite short in humility, they are complete in denial organisationally. So therefore, one wonders, what will happen to the Met itself as a structure?
Well, of course, and those recommendations have been put forward by Baroness Casey, 16 of them in full. And Sir Mark Rowley was questioned whether he would implement all 16 of them. Baroness Casey had said it wasn't going to be a pick and mix. All of them had to be applied in order for the Metropolitan Police to change for the better, which is what London needs. London Mayor Sadiq Khan has agreed with Baroness Casey. Of course, crime falls under his remit. He says this is one of the darkest days in the Metropolitan Police's history, and he agrees that all 16 of these changes need to be implemented. All 16 of these recommendations should be taken on board in full. So that is one thing that's going to be spoken about at the London Assembly Police and Crime Committee meeting tomorrow. Baroness Casey and Sir Mark Rowley will both be there in order to answer questions, and I'm sure the board will be asking them questions about how best those recommendations are implemented. The recommendations include looking completely again at stop and search within the capital. A dedicated women's protection service needs to be set up, she also suggests, and the diplomatic command department, the parliamentary protection department that Wayne Couzens was a part of, Baroness Casey suggests that that should be disbanded in its current forms, and firearms officers again should be re-vetted. So those are the kinds of changes that we're talking about. They're not going to be quick and they're not going to be fast, but she says that is the only way that the Metropolitan Police Force can continue. She has warned that the scale of the reforms are on par with what we saw in Northern Ireland when the Royal Ulster Constabulary became the police service of Northern Ireland in 2001. So she is warning that if they don't get to the bottom of this rotten culture in the next 5 years, then we could see the Metropolitan Police Force be completely disbanded.
Ellie, at New Scotland Yard, thank you for that. And as we say, Suella Braverman due to react to that fairly shortly in the Commons. We'll have that for everyone live as it happens. But let's just update you on this breaking news we brought you on Boris Johnson's release of his defence, effectively, before the Commons Privileges Committee tomorrow, basically saying it remains unclear to him and possibly to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, why they were both fined for breaching lockdown laws. But in terms of the defence, where he deliberately misled Parliament is the accusation, he says here that Sue Gray's report had shocked the public, but they shocked me, he said. It is now clear that over a number of days there were gatherings at number 10 that, however, they began, went past the point where they could be said to have been reasonably necessary for work purposes. He went on to say, it is, of course, true that my statements to Parliament that the rules and guidance have been followed at all times did not turn out to be correct. I take this opportunity to apologise to the House for that. And then going on this key fourth paragraph in terms of defence before that committee tomorrow, I accept that the House of Commons was misled by my statements that the rules and guidance have been followed completely at number 10. But when the statements were made, said Mr Johnson, they were made in good faith on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. I did not intentionally, key phrases, or recklessly mislead the House on the 1st December 2021, 8th of December 2021, or any other date. I would never have dreamed of doing so. Will that defence be enough to save him? We'll be assessing that. Stay with us here on GB News Live.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway, Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Let's reflect more on that damning report into the Met Police finding institutional misogyny, homophobia and sexism at the heart of the force. Baroness Casey going on to say there were elements of a boys' club, white and male, did not have full confidence that the report of rape or sexual assault would be treated properly. Let's get now the views of Ruth Davison, Chief Executive Officer of the Refuge charity, which provides specialist support for women and children who've experienced domestic violence. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ruth. I mean, it doesn't pull its punches, but it really is quite shocking, some of the things that Baroness Casey has highlighted. Does it surprise you?
No, it doesn't, unfortunately. You're right. The report is incredibly distressing, but it is not shocking to Refuge. This is what women and girls have been telling us for some time now. We know that people turn to us every 2 minutes, and yet only 1 in 5 of the women that we support have the confidence to report what has happened to them to the police. And levels of trust and confidence in policing are falling over and over again. This report just confirms some of the terrible, terrible stories that we have already heard.
And in terms of what should happen now and the reaction, we've got Sir Mark Rowley saying he does not accept that the charge of it being institutional is correct. Systemic, he would prefer it to say. I mean, is it the fact that they're already starting to try and tiptoe around it?
That's how it appears to me. And I have to say this morning, that is the shocking part of it. Why not just accept these findings? We had so much hope and confidence in Sir Mark Rowley's leadership that he'd moved the narrative on from 1 or 2 bad apples. But now he's talking about thousands of toxic officers, as opposed to a toxic police force that is fundamentally rotten and needs overhauling in terms of its culture and ways of operating. Of course, he must drive out the offending criminal members of staff who are working in the Met, but there is so much more to do than that. And I am disappointed and surprised to hear Sir Mark Rowley distancing himself from the very clear findings of this report today.
Yes, Baroness Casey describing the Met as long in hubris and quite short in humility. It needs complete overhaul and a new approach. Therefore, what would you like to see? What do you think should be done? Because Sir Mark has said that because it is such a huge force and London is so complex, it's difficult then to split the Met up, if you like.
Yeah, and I don't think that that is necessary at this stage. But what we have to see is that the chasm between the rhetoric that violence against women and girls is a strategic policing priority, and then the reality of the horrifying stories from this report and the statistics in this report, that gap has to close. So I would suggest today very clearly there's immediate action that can be taken. We don't have to wait 5 years. One of the things that we have been calling for as Refuge is the immediate suspension of any officer who faces accusations of domestic abuse or sexual offences against women and girls. If those officers were immediately suspended whilst they were investigated, I think we could start to have some confidence as women that when we come forward to report crimes against us, we are not reporting them to an abuser. So that could be done immediately if the will was there.
OK. And in terms of your belief that something will change in the short term, do you think that you're going to get anything from the various reports that inevitably will follow this?
There has been report after report. There's been apology after apology, nice words, strong words. What we're not seeing is the kind of radical action that is so desperately needed. Still, every single week here in the United Kingdom, 2 women lose their lives at the hands of their current or their former partner. These are appalling statistics. Women are dying. We cannot keep waiting. So I don't have huge confidence. But if this is not the time for change, then we are hearing from the highest levels, from the Home Secretary, from the Mayor of London, that enough is enough now. And this is the last chance. I really hope it isn't that they take it.
OK, Ruth, thank you for that. And as we say, we are due to hear from the Home Secretary in the Commons shortly, so we'll see what she's got to say. Thank you very much indeed for your time here in GB News. But let's bring in now former Met Police officer and author Graham Wetton, who has followed these issues, of course, for us here on GB News. First, Graham, your response to the various findings of Baroness Casey.
I think overall, I welcome the review. And again, I think you've highlighted this in your introductions earlier on. This review, the report, has actually been brought from stories, accounts, anecdotes from serving officers. It's almost like the police's own marking their own homework. This has come from police officers, serving officers, who are saying these things are happening. It highlights for me, and if you go past all the headlines, it highlights poor leadership, poor management, and a poor structure. And that's what needs really addressing. That's the focus, really. And we need to move forward from the past problems and look at solutions rather than just the problems.
Well, you used the interesting phrase, marking your own homework. Clearly now, the suggestion is they won't be able to mark their future performance, if you like, that has to be measured by some other way. That question, who polices the Met Police?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I think it needs... I think politicians, the mayor's office, there's other avenues, other organisations that have an oversight of not just the police, but policing in general. College of Policing, again, put in national structures, national frameworks. I think there's an awful lot of other people that need to look at how they structure police, how they have an overview and an oversight of exactly what's going on with policing, not just in London, but across the whole country, because this does affect the whole of the country. I know it's about the Met specifically, but that does have an impact on everybody else policing across the UK.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. Is it something that affects all police forces, not just the Met, or is it perhaps just pointed up in the Met because obviously it has to deal with so many cases? And that existential question, how do you change a culture?
That's a really good question as well. I think it just comes from policing. It highlights the issues across policing as a whole. The Met exaggerates it because of its size and the frequency of the problems, the crime problems, the issues. As your last speaker just mentioned, domestic abuse, violence against women and girls. But that's going on across the country. So every police force suffers these similar problems, but in maybe a less or a lower level. So this is a wake-up call, really, for the whole country, for politicians as well, to look at policing and see what policing they actually want in the country, not just within London. London's clearly, the capital city, has a bigger problem. But look at the issues across the whole country. This should be a wake-up call for everybody. What sort of police service do the public want, and do you actually want to serve you? And bring it in place, because the police officers want that. They want to go out and deal with crime. They want to protect people and safeguard people. It's the officers themselves that are saying this in this report. We need the tools, the resources, the funding, etc., to actually do the job for you. But what do the public want?
Yeah, we're going to go to the Commons fairly shortly with Suella Braverman due to make a statement. In fact, I think we can go there now. Graham, sorry to interrupt you. We'll get your reaction perhaps in a moment. Let's take you over to the Commons. The Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hall, is on
However,
I
would ask members to exercise caution and avoid referring to the detail of any cases which are currently or soon to be before the courts, to avoid any risk of prejudicing proceedings, particularly criminal proceedings. We now come to the statement. Home Secretary. Are we all ready?
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement about Baroness Casey's review of the Metropolitan Police. I wish to put on record my thanks to Baroness Casey for undertaking this review on such a difficult and sensitive topic with the utmost professionalism. The Metropolitan Police Service plays a big role in our country, tackling crime throughout the capital and keeping 9 million Londoners safe, preventing terrorism nationally, and managing significant threats to our capital and country. Mr. Speaker, I back the police. I trust them to put their safety before ours, to step into danger, to protect the most vulnerable, to support all of us at our most fearful, painful, and tragic moments. Many of us can never imagine the challenges that regular police officers face every day. That's particularly poignant as tomorrow marks the 6th anniversary of the murder of PC Keith Palmer in the line of duty whilst he was protecting all of us in this place. And for their contribution, I'm sure all members will join me in thanking the police for their work. But, Mr. Speaker, there have been growing concerns around the performance of the Metropolitan Police and its ability to command the confidence and trust of Londoners. This follows a series of abhorrent cases of officers who betrayed the public's trust and hideously abused their powers. In June last year, the Inspectorate announced that the force would be put into an engage phase. In July, this government appointed Sir Mark Rowley to the post of Metropolitan Police Commissioner with the express purpose of turning the organisation around. Today's report, commissioned by Sir Mark's predecessor, makes for very concerning reading. It's clear that there have been serious failures of culture, leadership and standards within the Metropolitan Police. That's why Sir Mark Rowley's top priority since becoming Commissioner has been to deliver a plan to turn around the Met and restore confidence in policing in London. Baroness Casey's report finds deep-seated cultural issues in the force, persistent poor planning and short-termism, a failure of local accountability, insularity and defensiveness, a lack of focus on core areas of policing, including public protection. And she highlights the recent decline in trust and confidence in the Met among London's diverse communities. The report underlines the fact that the Met faces a long road to recovery. Improvements must be made as swiftly as possible, but some of the huge challenges for the organisation may take years to fully address. Baroness Casey is clear that Sir Mark and Deputy Commissioner Lynn Owens accept the scale of these challenges, and I know this to be true from my own work with them. I will ensure that the Metropolitan Police have all the support from central government they need to deliver on Sir Mark's pledge of more trust, less crime and high standards. Every officer in the force needs to be part of making these changes happen. As I said, as soon as I became Home Secretary, I want all forces to focus relentlessly on common sense policing that stops crime and keeps the public safe. This government is already providing the Metropolitan Police with support to do just that. Funding for the force will be up to £3.3 billion in 2023, a cash increase of £178 million compared with 2010, and the force has by far the highest funding per capita in England and Wales. As a result of the government's police uplift programme, the Metropolitan Police has more officers than ever before, over 35,000 as of December. The Home Office is providing funding to the force to deliver innovative projects to tackle drug misuse and county lines. We are working with police and health partners to roll out a national right care, right person model to free up frontline officers to focus on investigating and fighting crime and ensuring that people in mental health crises get the right care from the right agency at the right time. Mr. Speaker, it is vital that the law-abiding public do not face a threat from the police themselves. Those who are not fit to wear the uniform must be prevented from doing so, and where they are revealed, they must be driven out of the force and face justice. We've taken steps to ensure that forces are tackling weaknesses in their vetting systems. I've listened to Sir Mark and his colleagues, and the Home Office is reviewing the police dismissals process to ensure that officers who fall short of expected standards can be quickly dismissed. The findings of Baroness Casey's review will help inform the work of Lady Angelini, whose independent inquiry, established by the government, will look at broader issues of police standards and culture. I'd like to turn to two particularly concerning aspects of Baroness Casey's report. Firstly, the report addresses questions of racism, misogyny and homophobia within the Metropolitan Police. Baroness Casey has identified evidence of discriminatory behaviour among officers, and I commend those officers who came forward to share their awful experiences with the review team. Discrimination must be tackled in all its forms, and I welcome Sir Mark's commitment to do so. I will be holding the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London to account by measuring their progress. I ask Londoners to judge Sir Mark and the Mayor of London not on their words, but on their actions to stamp out racist, misogynistic and homophobic behaviour. Indeed, action, not words, has been something that victims of police misconduct and criminal activity have asked for themselves. Secondly, officers working in the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command perform a vital function in protecting our embassies and keeping us, as members of Parliament, safe on the parliamentary estate. Baroness Casey's report is scathing in its analysis of the command's culture, and the whole House will be acutely aware of two recent cases of officers working in that command committing the most abhorrent crimes. I expect the Metropolitan Police to make sure that the reforms reflect the gravity of her findings, while ensuring that the command's critical security functions are maintained. The Home Office and the Parliamentary Security Department will work closely with the Metropolitan Police to ensure that this happens. Mr. Speaker, while I work closely with the Metropolitan Police, primary and political accountability, as Baroness Casey makes clear, sits with the Mayor of London. I spoke with the Mayor yesterday, and we are united in our support for the new Commissioner and his plan to turn around the Met so that Londoners get the police service that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, we all depend on the police, who overwhelmingly do a very difficult job bravely and well. It is vital that all officers maintain the very highest standards that the public expects of them. Londoners demand nothing less, and I have every confidence that Sir Mark Rowley and his team will deliver that for them. I commend their statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The report published today by Louise Casey, commissioned by the Mayor of London into standards and culture in the Metropolitan Police Service, is thorough, forensic and truly damning. It finds consent is broken, management of the force has failed, frontline policing, especially neighbourhood policing, has been deprioritised and degraded after a decade of austerity in which the Met has ended up with £0.7 billion less than at the beginning of the decade. It finds the Met is failing women and children, that predatory and unacceptable behaviour have been allowed to flourish, and it finds institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia. Baroness Casey pays tribute to the work police officers do and the bravery that they show every day, and all of us should do so, because across the country we depend on the work that police officers do to keep us all safe, catching criminals, protecting the vulnerable, saving lives, and we support them in that vital work. But that is what makes it all the more important that the highest of standards are maintained and confidence in those the police surveys sustained. Otherwise, it lets down communities and the vital work police officers do. We support the work the new Met Commissioner is doing now to start turning the Met around. He and his team must now go much further in response to the Casey review. But I am concerned that the Home Secretary's statement is dangerously complacent. Exactly. Astonishingly, there is no new action set out in her response, simply words saying that the Met must change. This is a continuation of the hands-off Home Office response that Baroness Casey criticises in her report. Some of the issues raised are particular to the Met because of its size, history and particular culture, where the Home Secretary and Mayor are jointly responsible for oversight and where the Commissioner is responsible for delivering. But the report also raises serious wider issues for the Home Office. The failure to root out officers who've been involved in domestic abuse, sexual assault, also applies in other forces. The failure to tackle culture has gone wrong in other forces too, problems in Gwent, Hampshire, Police Scotland, Sussex, Leicestershire and more. And it is a disgrace that there still are not mandatory requirements on vetting and training underpinned by law, that misconduct systems are still too weak. And I urge her to commit now that anyone under investigation for domestic abuse or sexual assault will be automatically suspended from their role as a police officer, and that anyone with any kind of history of domestic abuse or sexual assault will not be given any chance to become a police officer. We need an urgent overhaul underpinned by law. Will she give us that commitment today? The Home Office approach more widely to standards is also failing. 6 police forces are in so-called special measures, but it is still too easy for forces to ignore the recommendations from the Inspectorate, and the intervention processes are too weak. Where is her plan to turn that around? The report is damning about the decimation of frontline policing, but neighbourhood policing has been decimated everywhere, not just in the Met. 6,000 fewer police officers in neighbourhood teams, 8,000 fewer PCSOs, just than 2016, and it's worse than that because officers are routinely abstracted for other duties. So where is the plan to restore neighbourhood policing? Labour has set out a plan. We would work with the government on this, but where is the government's plan? The report finds is devastating for the lack of proper public protection arrangements for women and children who have been let down. But again, we know that across the country, prosecutions for rape and domestic abuse have plummeted, and serious cases have too often been dismissed. So again, where is the National Action Plan to improve public protection? Where is the commitment to specialist rape investigation units in every force, specialist domestic abuse experts in 999 control rooms? It is not happening. And the findings on institutional misogyny, racism and homophobia are based on evidence and clear criteria that Baroness Casey has set out for measuring change with recommendations. The Home Secretary rightly says she wants discrimination tackled in all its forms, but she has been telling police forces the opposite and telling them not to focus on those issues. So where is her plan now to turn that around? Where is the Home Office plan in response to this? On standards, on neighbourhood policing, on violence against women and girls, and on systemic or institutional discrimination. Where are those plans? The British policing model is precious. Those Peel principles that started in London, policing by consent, the police are the public are the police. They are our guardians, not our guards. But that precious policing model is in peril. The Home Office and the Home Secretary are the custodians of that tradition. But the lack of any plan to restore trust or to stand things up for policing or to turn things round is letting everyone down. It's not standing up for the police, it's letting both police and communities down. It's because we believe in policing, because we believe in those Peel principles, that we know standing up for the police also means working with the police to deliver change and to restore the trust, the confidence and effective policing that all police officers and communities properly deserve.
That's the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, there asking where is the national plan to deal with these issues, in her views, saying that Suella Braverman's statement, dangerously complacent, she said, continuation of a hands-off approach from the Home Office that had been criticised in the report. The Home Secretary, however, saying that the Met faces a long road to recovery. It may take years to address some issues, she said. Well, let's get the views now of former Met police officer and author Graham Wetton, who is following those events, and to get his reaction. Graham, just in terms of that assessment that it may take years to address some issues, have they got the time to allow that to happen? Surely that something needs to be done in the short term as well.
Well, I think the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, and Damien Knowles, the Deputy, have already got a plan. They've started a plan to look at resources on the street, the restructure, the structure of the Met, the management, leadership, etc. So I think they've already started on that plan. So, whether they've got the time, I think, is incumbent on maybe the politicians, the people who decide who stays in post and whether they want them. But for me, hearing what they're saying, I'm confident as well they are the right people now at the right time to take the Met forward and actually deal with solutions rather than keep looking back at problems.
And in terms of figures, Suella Braverman saying 3.3 billion in funding now, 178 million cash increase. But then we had Yvette Cooper saying, actually, it's 0.7 billion less than at the beginning of the decade. So I guess that's another question. Are the resources actually being put into the service?
No, well, not to my knowledge, no. And I think we're almost getting back to where we were back in 2010. So we're almost getting, I think one of the quotes takes us back to a level around 2010. Well, population increases, demand's increased. So I think you need to look at, again, the resources, and it keeps coming down, sadly, to funding and money, budget cuts, etc. Austerity, we've been through this loads and loads of times. But policing needs to go beyond where we were in 2010 in relation to, I think the Home Secretary mentioned, the establishment figures are more than they've ever been before. But again, we're trying to keep up with population increases, specifically within London, and demand on police, which has increased because other services have suffered as well. So everything's increasing, whereas maybe the money pot itself hasn't been increased by those in charge. So they need to look at this again and listen to what the police chiefs, the senior officers, are saying they need to meet the needs that the public's putting on policing.
Now, Yvette Cooper was continuing asking where is the plan, the specialist plan, or even a national plan, she was indicating, touching on the issue that you addressed, that maybe this is not particularly a problem for the Met. It is an issue being faced by all police forces.
Yeah, I think this just highlights the problems across the country as a whole in policing, in that policing across the country faces problems with plans around neighbourhood policing, being in touch with their communities. Because when it came down to deciding what your priority was, clearly a priority for policing is responding to 999 calls, those emergency calls, as opposed to being visible and seen in your community and walking around on a daily basis and saying hello to everybody. When you had to decide between one or the other, clearly we had to prioritise towards those emergency calls. But we need to get back now to being amongst the community, increasing again neighbourhood teams, community teams, being in touch with. And she mentioned the phrase I used to teach, the public, the police of the public. And that's exactly where policing needs to get back to. But they need the numbers and the resources to be able to do that. And they need to be back out amongst their communities. Hundreds of police stations have been closed across the country, not just within London, but literally across the country. You are miles now from a police station, and the police officers then have to travel miles to get to their communities. It's almost like a perfect storm has been created over the last 12 years.
Yeah, I just wonder then, but clearly if then there is this push to get back to, the bobbies on the beat, neighbourhood policing and so on, where do those specialist officers then come from to deal with this other issue that Yvette Cooper has pointed up, and that is the sexual offences, violence against women and children? Clearly resources of a very specialist nature needed for that.
Yeah, they do, and I think the report does touch on. I haven't got to that section yet specifically, but it does mention in the recommendations around. The Met used to have what's called a Sapphire unit. It used to specialise in dealing with sexual offences. To my knowledge, they were all like reduced, decimated when we had to cut figures, budgets, numbers, etc. So again, that needs to become a priority for policing, because as long as I was in the police, violence against women, domestic incidents were always an issue for us. We always had to send resources to deal with them. So having specialists in that area to actually understand the issues, to take an investigation from start to finish and provide that service to the victims is absolutely essential.
Last thought, the very fact that so much is being focused on now and is being made public and put into the public arena, do you think this may well encourage the good apples, if I can put it that way, within the Met and other police forces to come forward, blow the whistle and be more confident about complaining about things within these structures?
Yeah, I think it does. I think I said that, I think it's in another interview, this report is actually from the police themselves. This is from officers speaking to, described to me, it was like having a chat with your aunt over a cup of tea. But they actually felt, for probably the first time, even before my service, they were actually being listened to by someone with some authority who's going to put their anecdotes, their accounts into a report. And that's what you're reading now. I'm finding myself, as I'm reading the report, you start nodding at some of the stories because you've heard about these. Yeah. So actually see it in black and white in the report that's actually been given to the bosses that they got to listen to and got to read the accounts. That must be really damaging. This is their own officers saying this has happened to me and it's not being dealt with. I don't feel I'm being supported. It is a pivotal moment in policing, and it should actually be read by all chief constables across the country.
Graham, thank you very much indeed for staying with us, bringing us your reaction there to what we heard from the Home Secretary. Thank you very much indeed. More reaction, of course, to come to this extraordinary report from Baroness Casey. And we'll be reacting to, has Boris Johnson fessed up? Will the defence stick in Parliament? We'll be making that assessment too from Westminster. Stay with us. Let's get an update now on the weather.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office. For most, a brighter day today compared to yesterday with some sunshine, but there are a few heavy showers around, still pretty mild as well. Weather systems are gathering out in the Atlantic. They're all going to bring spells of rain across the UK. One is clearing away, leaving us, as I said, with a brighter day, but still plenty of showers around over the Midlands and eastern England. Some pretty lively downpours this afternoon. A heavy shower is likely in a few places. Parts of Scotland seeing a scattering of showers. Much of Wales and southwest England will stay dry. Not too many showers here, and we see more persistent rain moving into Northern Ireland by the end of the afternoon. Pretty mild temperatures, mostly getting into the teens when the sun is shining. We could get up to 16 Celsius, but the breeze will be picking up as we go through the day, and it's going to get windy overnight. And not just windy, wet. That rain for Northern Ireland this afternoon spreads to most areas before midnight. Some quite heavy bursts of rain in the west, and the winds will get very gusty, particularly in western Scotland, come first thing on Wednesday morning. It'll be another pretty mild night with some towns and cities in the south staying in double figures. A fairly damp start then across East Anglia and the southeast to Wednesday morning. A very windy start in western Scotland, blustery conditions here, and those gusty winds will spread across northern Scotland with plenty of heavy showers through the day. We'll see some showers developing across parts of Wales and western England, and they'll spread further east come the afternoon. But again, many places actually seeing decent spells of sunshine, but it will be a windy day. Still pretty mild, double figures, maybe 15, 16 across the southeast, but feeling colder with the winds. The winds will ease a touch through Wednesday evening, but further bands of heavy showers coming in from the west, and that sets us up really for the rest of the working week with further spells of showery rain zipping across the country on blustery winds, staying pretty mild as well, but there are some signs of colder conditions spreading south this weekend.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 1 o'clock, you're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this Tuesday lunchtime, Boris holds his hands up. Yes, I did mislead the Commons over partygate, but it wasn't intentional or reckless, he says. Will the defence be enough to save his political career as he faces a parliamentary grilling? We'll have the very latest from Westminster. Where now for the Met? After today's damning report finding misogyny, racism, homophobia in the force, the Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, says they're not institutional problems. But the report's author, Baroness Casey, saying there needs to be a new approach. The Home Secretary has just told the Commons that could take years. So who will now police the police? Chinese President Xi Jinping in Moscow today to meet Vladimir Putin. It's reported they've been discussing a Chinese peace plan for the war in Ukraine. While earlier Russia flew 2 nuclear-capable bombers over the Sea of Japan for more than 7 hours, the US flew 2 US nuclear bombers towards the Russian border. The Cold War hots up. Let us know all your views on all those stories. GBviews at gbnews.uk. First, the latest headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 2 minutes past 1. Boris Johnson has accepted he misled Parliament over partygate, but he maintains it wasn't intentional or reckless. Submitting his 52-page defence dossier to the Privileges Committee, the former Prime Minister said gatherings at Downing Street during lockdown should never have happened. He also says statements in the House of Commons were made in good faith. He's due to give evidence before MPs tomorrow. A damning report into Britain's largest police force has been described by the Home Secretary as very concerning. Baroness Louise Casey, who led a review, found the Met Police is institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. She says victims have been let down and that officers who abuse their power have shattered public trust. The report also found the Met's current ethics standards and disciplinary procedures have failed abysmally and is calling for a complete overhaul. Home Secretary Suella Braverman says she has every faith the newly appointed Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, will be a catalyst for change.
There have been growing concerns around the performance of the Metropolitan Police and its ability to command the confidence and trust of Londoners. This follows a series of abhorrent cases of officers who betrayed the public's trust and hideously abused their powers. Today's report, commissioned by Sir Mark's predecessor, makes for very concerning reading. It's clear that there have been serious failures of culture, leadership and standards.
Former Detective Superintendent Shabnam Chowdhury told us she's appalled by the findings. She admits her career was tarnished after becoming a whistleblower and says officers should be able to speak out without fear of punishment.
When you're a whistleblower and you try to speak out, you very, very quickly find yourself isolated, you find yourself being victimised, you find yourself being intimidated by officers, you find your ranks being closed around you. There's an inability by leaders within the organisation and managers to fail to actually deal with these issues because they're too scared of their own career progression.
A group of Eurosceptic Conservative MPs has described parts of the Prime Minister's new Brexit deal with the EU as practically useless. The European Research Group commissioned lawyers to scrutinise the Windsor framework ahead of tomorrow's vote on the storm and break element of the proposal. A spokesperson for Rishi Sunak says it is a good deal and is urging lawmakers to back it. But the ERG's chair, Marc Francois, says issues still need to be addressed.
EU law will still be supreme in Northern Ireland. The rights of its people under the 1800 Act of Union are not restored. The Green Lane is not really a green lane at all. The Stormont break is practically useless, and the framework itself has no exit other than through a highly complex legal process.
Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are beginning a second day of talks as part of the Chinese leader's state visit to Moscow. Discussions today are expected to be more formal. Yesterday, Putin welcomed his dear friend to the Kremlin and the pair discussed China's peace plan for Ukraine. President Xi has invited Putin to visit China and called for regular meetings. The Transport Secretary is calling on the RMT to give its members a vote on the latest pay offer from rail operators so next week's strikes can be called off. It's after members of the union who work for Network Rail accepted a similar pay rise of between 9.2% and 14.4%. Industrial action is planned by the RMT for next Thursday and Saturday, but Mark Harper is urging them to call it off.
Network Rail can now get on with delivering reform to how they deliver maintenance and how they run the infrastructure on the railways. That's halfway done. I think the next stage is that I want the RMT to put what is broadly the same fair and reasonable offer to their members that work for the train operating companies and call off next week's strike. So I think that would be fantastic news for the travelling public if their members, if the RMT members get the chance to consider that pay offer as well for those that work on the train companies themselves.
This is GB News. More headlines from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
Tamsin, thank you very much indeed. So the much-anticipated Partygate defence has been published by Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, accepting that he had indeed misled the House of Commons, but adding that wasn't intentional or reckless, a key phrase. Let's get more at Westminster and our political reporter Olivia Utley with more, I was going to say meat on the bone, but maybe more wine and cheese perhaps would be more accurate, Olivia. Boris Johnson saying he trusted the assurances of former Director of Communications Jack Doyle that a mid-pandemic Christmas party was within the rules. Wine and cheese and exchanging gifts at the desk, that did not sound to me like a breach of the rules or the guidance, let alone a party, said Mr Johnson.
Yes, so essentially Boris Johnson's defence rests on the fact that what he says is that he didn't know that he was breaking the rules, and so when he stood up and said that he was doing everything within the rules, he was acting in good faith. And this 52-page dossier that he's put together is essentially gathering up all sorts of evidence from WhatsApp messages, from communication between him and his advisors, in which his advisors appear to tell him that there is no breach of the rules. So when he relayed that information to the House, he says he was acting in good faith. It's not his fault if that guidance was wrong. Now, he knows, because you can see in his dossier that he knows that the committee will come back by saying, well, even if your advisors told you the wrong advice, surely it was obvious to you that you were breaking the rules. Surely you know what a party looks like. Well, his defence there is that there were plenty of people at these gatherings. If it wasn't obvious to him, why should it be obvious to, if it wasn't obvious to any of them, why should it be obvious to him? He also, interestingly, points to the fact that some of the photographs that we've been seeing splashed on the front pages of the newspapers were taken by the number 10 official photographer. And why, he says, would he have an official photographer taking photos of him obviously breaking the rules? Now, it actually goes further than that, what his dossier says, because essentially he is laying into this committee, and we can see already that relationships between Boris Johnson and the Privileges Committee are at an all-time low. Boris Johnson has accused them of acting outside of the scope of their original investigation. So they were supposed to be looking into whether he lied, i.e. intentionally misled Parliament. They've now changed the wording about what they're looking into intentionally or recklessly. Well, Boris Johnson doesn't like that at all. The committee, meanwhile, have come back and had a go at Boris Johnson's tardiness. So they say that if he wanted his publication, this dossier, out there quickly, he's saying that they have withheld it. They're saying, well, he should have published it more than 48 hours before he's due to speak to the committee. And they're saying that it was riddled with typos the first time it was submitted. So we can see the extent to which Boris Johnson and this committee are not getting on. I think we can all expect fireworks at 2 p.m. tomorrow when Boris Johnson finally sits down in front of those 7 MPs who you could say might decide his fate.
Yeah, and one reflects maybe it is up to the committee themselves to decide what their terms of reference are, not actually the person who is being questioned. But he does have, of course, a fairly high-powered lawyer, Lord Panic KC, with £220,000 of taxpayers' money being made available to launch his defence. It could well just come down to these two words then, intentionally or recklessly, in terms of this act of misleading Parliament.
Yes, absolutely. So Boris Johnson would argue that, yes, it might be up to the committee to set the terms of reference, but all of the precedent for this kind of committee is to decide whether an MP lied to the House. Now, we know that lying to the House, intentionally misleading the House, is a swinging offence. And it sounds, well, at least Boris Johnson believes, as though the committee doesn't have evidence that he intentionally misled the House. Boris Johnson's interpretation of that is they would need evidence to show that he had been told he'd misled the House, and then he stood up and said that he wasn't sure about the rules and he didn't know that there were parties going on. So it all hinges on whether the committee is able to use that word intentionally in quite a loose context, and whether, if it was obvious to Boris Johnson, if they believe that any normal person would have seen that there was a party taking place, if that can be referred to as intentionally misleading. All comes down to this interpretation of intentionally, and whether or not someone can recklessly mislead Parliament. Is that a term that will be allowed in the frame of reference?
Yeah, and of course it will be the committee, not Mr Johnson himself, who decides whether that actually applies or not. Olivia, for the moment, thank you. But let's just actually reflect once more. We have actually got a copy of the introduction of Boris Johnson's defence that will be put before that committee tomorrow. It will be televised, so we'll have it here for you tomorrow. But the key points to start with, the revelations in Sue Gray's report shocked the public, and they shocked me, said Mr Johnson. I therefore begin by renewing my apologies to the British people for what happened on my watch. It is now clear that over a number of days, there were gatherings at number 10 that, however they began, went past the point where they could be said to have been reasonably necessary for work purposes. That should never have happened. It fills me with sadness, and I regret that it did. Going on to say then, it is of course true my statements to Parliament that the rules and guidance have been followed at all times did not turn out to be correct. I take this opportunity to apologise to the House for that. And then, towards the end, the key paragraph where he says, I accept that the House of Commons was misled by my statements that the rules and guidance had been followed completely at number 10. But when the statements were made, said Mr Johnson, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. I did not intentionally or recklessly mislead the House on the 1st December 2021, 8th of December 2021, or on any other date. I would never have dreamed of doing so. Well, joining us now is Edwina Curry, a former Conservative MP. Thank you very much indeed for your time. If you were on that committee, would you buy that defence?
I think if I was on that committee, I'd be having a good laugh, a good quiet laugh. I mean, it's premised on the idea that the words honestly and would never have dreamed of doing so would be an accurate reflection of what we know about Boris. And it's rather the opposite on the whole. And the committee, of course, is not composed of judges. The committee is composed of politicians, and some of them have been in the House of Commons an awful lot longer than Boris has. So they'll be very good indeed at producing some wording. I mean, my guess is, Mark, that they're going to find him guilty one way or another. And the word that they're homing in on is recklessly. Yeah. Because if you become aware that something funny is going on, especially in those circumstances, and if you let it continue, and if you accept, balance of doubt, well, it's not too bad, when in fact what you should be doing is walking through the office and saying, this looks like a party to me, go home. If you want to celebrate, go to the pub. Oh, the pubs are closed. Well, there's a reason for that. It's called COVID. Stop this. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. You're in the office to work, and everything else is verboten. You cannot do it. And we in particular, says the Prime Minister of the day, who's highly intelligent, we in particular are not going to sanction anything that is at all dodgy. Can you imagine Boris saying that? Because I can't.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's 52 pages of it. And just to sort of dig down a bit further, he's saying that he trusted the assurances of his former Director of Communications, Jack Doyle, that a mid-pandemic Christmas party was, quote, within the rules. It's in this context I understood members of the press office who were gathered for work purposes, key phrase, of course, in number 10, leading the government's response to COVID-19, had wine and cheese and exchanged gifts at their desk. This did not sound to me like a breach of the rules or the guidance, let alone a party, close quotes.
Yeah, well, he's dumping on his staff, isn't he? Which, again, a minister and certainly a prime minister shouldn't do. One of the aspects of honour when you are in very senior positions is you take responsibility. And you certainly don't dump by name on members of your staff who are not really in a position to defend themselves. And you could also, Mark, what you and I might do is we might actually question that and say, are you sure? Well, let's err on the side of caution. Let's not have a party. And for goodness sake, it's my birthday next week. If there's any hint or anyone suggesting that there's going to be a party here, they will be out the door. Is that clear? And that is not what Boris did. Entirely the opposite.
And last question then, what do you make of the fact that Rishi Sunak has told MPs, the Tory MPs, they can have a free vote to actually decide on whatever sanction or not that the committee decides on?
Yeah, that's the rumour that I heard last week. So they've obviously been thinking hard about how to do it. There'll be a sanction of some kind. There are a lot of MPs on the Tory side in the House of Commons who'll be glad to see the back of Boris, or who are, shall we say, sick to death of him being the agenda, when what they would like to be the agenda is the effort that the government is making, the good efforts that the government is making. So they'll be able, some of them will vote against him, with the Labour Party, and some will simply abstain. What will happen after that depends on what the sanction is, what the result is, whether there's an automatic by-election called. Nobody knows any of that. There's lots and lots and lots of what-ifs we can't get to just right now. Tomorrow, however, guaranteed, Mark, will be magnificent theatre. We'll all be glued to it. And Boris, I think, will be the star, even if he doesn't end up as getting away with it.
So we can count on you watching on GB News tomorrow, then?
Oh, I think I probably will be.
OK, we'll welcome you along as one of perhaps, I think, quite a substantial number be watching that particular show. Edwina Curry, thank you very much indeed for your time. Now, let's return to this damning report into the Met Police, which has found institutional misogyny, homophobia and sexism at the heart of the force, commissioned after the abduction and murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer. Well, it details stories of more cover-ups and sexual assaults. 12% of women in the Met itself saying they had themselves been harassed or attacked at work. The report's author, Baroness Casey, saying the force now needs a complete overhaul. But the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, already rejecting that charge that the problems are institutional, saying they were systemic. Well, let's speak now to our national reporter, Ellie Costello, who's at Scotland Yard. And, of course, Ellie, we've also had now Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, acknowledging once more the issues, but reflecting it may take years for them to be addressed.
Yes, good afternoon to you, Mark. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has just stood up in the House of Parliament just a few minutes ago and gave a statement in response to this review. She said that the primary and political accountability sits with the Mayor of London. She said she's going to be holding the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London to account by measuring their progress. And she went on to say that victims of police misconduct are asking for action, not words, when tackling wrongdoing in the police force. That's her response just literally a few moments ago to this new review, which found that racism, sexism and homophobia are at the heart of the Metropolitan Police Force. This is a review by Baroness Casey, which was commissioned in the wake of the abduction, the rape and the murder of Sarah Everard. And it took 12 months for this review to take place. And in that time, another serving Metropolitan Police officer, David Carrick, was convicted of 12 sexual offences, including rape, 12 victims, including rape. So this is Baroness Casey speaking about the need for reform in the Metropolitan Police.
And the moment that Sarah Everard was raped, abducted, raped and then murdered by a serving police officer, I find it extraordinary that in policing and in the Met Police, that wasn't their moment of like a plane falling out of the sky. I just think it is so dreadful, and, you know, has to be a moment that change came. Change didn't come, so now this report has to carry that and has to take responsibility for getting the change needed that we should have had at the point that that young woman lost her life.
Well, the evidence in this 363-page inquiry includes evidence of fridges in the Metropolitan Police offices that were packed full of evidence breaking down, and that meant that the evidence was lost and therefore alleged rape cases had to be dropped. We also read about a Muslim officer who found pork in his shoes that had been left by his colleagues. There were instances of officers urinating on each other and sexually inappropriate behaviour in the office. 12% of female officers had experienced sexual harassment whilst serving in the Metropolitan Police Force. This is scathing reading for the Metropolitan Police Force. And Sir Mark Rowley, the Commissioner, has been speaking this morning. He has issued an apology to Londoners, but he hasn't gone so far as to agree that this is institutionalised racism, sexism and misogyny. He admits that it's systemic, but he says that these changes will have to be implemented. He doesn't go as far as to say that all of them will be, and Baroness Casey has made it clear that this isn't a pick and mix. All of them will need to be implemented in order for the Metropolitan Police Force to be a trust that people trust and have confidence in.
Yeah. Ellie, thank you very much indeed for updating us there at New Scotland Yard. And just to remind you that debate continues in the Commons following the Home Secretary's statement. Actually, I can just update you that, in fact, Suella Braverman has said she agrees with the head of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark, that institutional is not a helpful term to use. She said it's ambiguous, contested and a politically charged term that is much misused and risks making it harder for officers to win back the trust of communities. Well, joining us now in the studio is Chris Hobbs, a former Met Police officer. Chris, this is an interesting reaction from both Sir Mark and Suella Braverman on this term institutional, which, of course, we remember back in 1999 was a term used in terms of the reaction to the Stephen Lawrence case and the Macpherson report.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's a lot of confusion about what it means, to be quite honest. I think it's been interpreted, when Macpherson used it, as basically institutional means officers are racist across the board. And
not just bad apples, as the other phrase means.
There's a problem with basically all officers. I'm not sure that's true. I think there are too many definitions around institutional. Having said that, of course, the Met has got a problem, without a doubt. I do feel sorry for Met officers at the moment who are going out on response at the sharp end, who are having to perform their duties with this hanging over them. I think it's important to realise, despite the damning contents of the report, is that the overwhelming majority of officers in the next 24 hours in London, there will be some remarkable acts of bravery, kindness and compassion carried out, as there always are. That seems to be getting lost at the moment. The image now, when you look at the first part of the report, there's lots of condemnation about the organisation and so on. And you could see officers on social media, serving officers, applauding that. Since 2010, it has been a shambles. When you go on to the second part of the report, you've got officers really holding their heads in despair.
Right. OK, well, let's park that term institutional then and look at what Sir Mark wanted in its place, systemic. Does that still indicate that there's got to be some reorganisation of a pretty drastic nature? Bearing in mind, Suella Braverman said these problems could take years to address. I mean, Sir Mark's not got that long, has he, to sort this out?
Well, he's certainly got a challenge, without a doubt. I think the problem within the Met is that because of training, vetting, recruitment are all issues. But you've got groups, knots of officers. It's a bit like the school bullies. They tend to congregate together, don't they, and form a group that is basically antisocial and becomes a problem. I think that's what we have in the Met. Remember, over 10 years, we've had 60,000 Met police officers and staff working for the people of London. There are not 60,000 bad apples.
So do you believe, then, that the attempts which Sir Mark has indicated, and I think 30 to 40 cases coming through at the moment, he said, if that is pushed forward, that will actually bring the culture back round then, removing the so-called bad apples, rather than thinking that the whole system is broken?
I think so. I think that's what most serving officers want. Right. They want the bad apples, the lazy, the corrupt, the ones who are misogynistic, the ones who are racist. They want them out. Having said that, there's a lot of disappointment about the second half of the report, where the Baroness Casey, talks about over-policing of the black community, violence towards, when arrests are being made. There's no real mention there of 400 weapons a month being taken off the street by stop and search, of the terrible consequences of knife crime within certain areas of London.
Which we report on, of course, week
and which police officers have to tackle. If police officers take a step back, as they could do, from, say, stop and search, we're going to be in real trouble in parts of London.
Well, last question on this. Do you think the fact that there is so much public attention on it, the focus is on the Met now, and these things are being put out into the public arena, would that encourage more officers to come forward and report on wrongdoing and things not being done in the right way?
I think so. I think it will encourage them. But on the other hand, I think it has to be borne in mind that the majority of officers don't like the rogues, don't like racist officers, and really do, despite the chaos in the organisation of the Met on a daily basis, time and time again, And the next 24 hours, they will be doing some fantastic life-saving work, which never really gets picked up by the media.
OK, Chris, thank you very much indeed for bringing us your reaction to that. And, of course, we'll continue to assess what's being said in that debate in the Commons with the Home Secretary. Coming up, too, here on GB News Live, the latest on China's president's visit to Moscow as the nuclear bombers are heading on, well, all sides, it seems. Is that Cold War hotting up? We'll have an assessment on that.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, Vladimir Putin's been holding formal talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping in the Kremlin, focusing on, of course, the war in Ukraine and Russia's apparently deepening economic ties with China. The Kremlin also saying both leaders have been discussing a Chinese peace deal. Well, Xi has also invited Putin to visit China this year, we're being told. But earlier today, Russia flew 2 nuclear-capable bomber planes over the Sea of Japan for more than 7 hours, and also reports that 2 US B-52s, nuclear-capable, of course, had been flying over the Baltic towards the Russian border. Let's get the views now of Alan Mendoza, Executive Director at the Henry Jackson Society, who joins us. Cold War hotting up a bit with bombers flying hither and thither?
Well, it's all rather reminiscent, isn't it, of games being played on both sides. You know, one country sends their bombers that way, another one goes that way. They scramble to repeat them. I mean, it should be worth pointing out, by the way, the Russians have done this for years with the UK.
Yeah.
For years, we've had to scramble planes because the Russians approach our borders. So it's a game the Russians know how to play very well.
But, of course, given the tensions at the moment, you know, one mistake could actually have consequences. And we saw that Reaper, the spy drone shot down, of course. But we're getting perhaps an indication that Xi wants things to calm down a little bit, and that clearly for China, there are not many gains if things hot up in Ukraine particularly.
No, I think the Chinese would love to be the sort of brokering party for some kind of deal. And look, it's clearly in China's interest to sort of freeze the conflict. It's actually, of course, in Russia's interest as well to freeze the conflict, since the Russians are essentially losing at the moment. But it would be a terrible sign if we were to stop right now, because it would just institutionalise Putin's control over the areas that he has aggressively seized. The Chinese would be happy with that, of course, because they don't want to see, as you say, any slippage in their Russian ally, but that's not necessarily good news for the free world, should we say.
Yeah, and the other fear is that China perhaps will become a more active partner, and clearly if they start providing ammunition and military hardware, then the whole balance changes, and Washington will be very concerned about that.
Yes, I mean, that would indicate the Chinese have taken a side, which so far they have studiously avoided doing. If they were to take a side, that would indeed change the military balance, because you would have the Russians being resupplied very quickly with Chinese material. However, that would open the Chinese up undoubtedly to American sanctions.
Yeah. Do you think Putin will actually listen if Xi says, that's it, enough is enough, you've really got to rethink this?
He might listen, but the problem is for Putin, he's not in control of that situation. Putin to say, I'm stopping at this point in time, I'm declaring a ceasefire, will not be accepted by Ukraine. So Putin can declare all he likes that he's stopping, but until he withdraws his forces from where they were before the invasion, there's no incentive for Ukraine, and nor should they stop in their attacks.
And prior to this meeting in Moscow, we had the suggestions from Washington that it might be rather useful if President Xi gets on the phone to Zelensky in Ukraine and also discusses the situation with it. Any indication that's about to happen?
Well, the Ukrainians have been pressing for it. There's been an attempt to say, right, you know, if you don't want to come, fine, but can you get on the phone and talk? Because right now you claim to be a neutral party in this, but you've gone there and you haven't gone there. It's also very strange, wouldn't you say, to sort of declare a peace treaty or try and get a peace and then not go to the main victim of the war and talk to them.
Yeah, and what would that deal have to look like? I mean, we assume, for instance, that Ukraine says, you've got to give Crimea back to us. That's, you know, that's a given.
We would assume that, but look, the details of that are for Ukraine and Russia to work out with the China if they want to go down that route. The reality is we know publicly the Ukrainians have said they want all their territory back, everything that's been taken since 2014, and that's understandable. Why wouldn't they? You know, I don't know if there'll be an interim deal done in that sort of way, if that's even viable. I'm not sure there is a viable, you know, kind of way through here right now, and it's not just posturing on the Chinese part.
And the other aspect, of course, everyone's trying to interpret the body language and whether Putin has got the tremors, or is his leg shaking, is his arm shaking, whatever. We are being told that China does not necessarily want to see Putin removed. They prefer to see him in place and things just held on a steadier, calmer sort of basis.
The Chinese hate any instability of any kind. They are very much, when it comes to their allies, a status quo power. They don't want to see anyone kicked out. They don't want to see anyone removed, because, of course, the corollary of that is we could be next.
Well, yeah, or Poland, or the Baltic states, of course. Alan, thank you very much indeed for your assessment. Of course, we'll keep you updated with what happens in those official talks in Moscow. But let's get an update now on all the other news headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Here are the headlines from the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson has accepted he misled Parliament over Partygate, but maintains it wasn't intentional or reckless. Submitting his 52-page defence dossier to the Privileges Committee, the former Prime Minister said gatherings at Downing Street during lockdown should never have happened. He also says statements in the House of Commons were made in good faith. He's due to give evidence before MPs tomorrow. A damning report into Britain's largest police force has been described by the Home Secretary as very concerning. It found the Met Police is institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. Baroness Louise Casey, who led the review, says victims have been let down and officers who abuse their power have shattered public trust. Home Secretary Suella Braverman says she has every faith the newly appointed Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, will be a catalyst for change. A group of Eurosceptic Conservative MPs has described parts of the Prime Minister's new Brexit deal with the EU as practically useless. The European Research Group commissioned lawyers to scrutinise the Windsor framework ahead of tomorrow's vote on the storm and break element of the proposal. The ERG's chair, Marc Francois, says issues still need to be addressed.
EU law will still be supreme in Northern Ireland. The rights of its people under the 1800 Act of Union are not restored. The Green Lane is not really a green lane at all. The Stormont break is practically useless, and the framework itself has no exit other than through a highly complex legal process.
TV, online radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Live. Now, if the Tories want to win the next election, which may be coming perhaps sooner than we think, they must retain at least some of the red wall seats across the North and the Midlands that they won from Labour. One such valuable seat, Don Valley, just outside Doncaster. It voted Tory for the first time in 2019. But last November, Doncaster and Sheffield Airport closed. Many local voters are angry at that, now campaigning to save the regional airport. Our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, has this special report for us.
Doncaster Airport last November. Thousands protest, angry at the closure of this busy South Yorkshire air hub. Also serving nearby Sheffield, Doncaster boasted daily flights to the US and mainland Europe. Less than 20 years old, this world-class facility now lies dormant. Airport owner the Peel Group says it's financially unviable. Local garage owner Mark Chadwick was shocked when Doncaster Airport closed. He set up a protest group on social media.
You couldn't find out why it was closing, what it was closing for, who was closing it. So I set up a Facebook group just to do something, just to see if we could find out what was happening. The first day we had 1,000 members, the first week we had 4,000 members. It's a travesty that what's happened to our local airport.
The online campaign to save Doncaster Sheffield Airport now has over 20,000 followers and rising. This was once RAF Finningley, which for decades hosted fondly remembered air shows as captured in this home movie. The case for Doncaster Airport today rests on its central location, close to Sheffield, Hull and Lincolnshire. Before lockdown, Doncaster boasted 1.4 million passengers in 2019 alone, generating directly and indirectly around 3,000 local jobs. Just 90 minutes by train from the capital, Doncaster could also take pressure off London's busy airports. Business leaders say this closure is a disaster for the local economy.
We're thinking about taxi drivers, the local hotels, bed and breakfast, caterers, all of those small businesses that actually supply the airport.
We're in Don Valley, a red wall seat the Tories won in 2019 and need to retain. The local MP says the Labour-run council and mayor should buy this facility, as happened with Teesside Airport in the northeast.
This is what happened in the north with Ben Houchin. He actually bought it. A Conservative mayor bought the airport and made it work. We need the same thing to happen here.
At Doncaster's Parkland Social Club, locals are adamant their airport should survive.
They don't need a third runway.
is it Gatwick and Heathrow, so can you have Doncaster? It's the hub of the country.
Sheffield Airport shut down a few years ago, so really Doncaster should have taken up the slack on that. And why it's shutting, I was still a bit mystified of why it's actually closing.
Going to sell the land for housing and they get more money than selling it as an airport or using it as an airport and keeping it running.
Peel Group refutes this and says the high fixed costs associated with running a safe regulated airport mean a break-even business plan can't be identified for the foreseeable future. Planes haven't landed in Doncaster since November, but the campaign to save this regional hub is in full flight. Liam Halligan, GB News.
Well, fresh back from Doncaster. He hasn't flown in for obvious reasons. Our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, now with On the Money. And Liam, just to rub a bit of salt in the wound, we're just now reading that Doncaster's actually just missed out on the new home for GBIHQ, Great British Railways. It has gone to Derby, who'll be very pleased. But interesting quote here from the local area in terms of what it means. And this is from the City Mayor, Ros Jones. Locating it here would have gone a long way in realising the government's levelling up aspirations for the area. And this is the key that you point. It's not just losing a regional hub, it's actually what it does and really getting levelling up in action.
Doncaster really is the heart of the Red Wall. There are 4 parliamentary seats around Doncaster. They've all voted Labour, quotes, forever. But in 2019, Caroline Flint, the Labour frontbencher, despite being a popular local MP, she lost that seat. It's a former coal mining area to Nick Fletcher, who appeared in our film.
Yeah.
And we've seen over recent years the vital importance of these regional airports in the UK for getting investment into regions and local economies. Teesside is a famous example. Newquay down in the West Country is another example. You've also got airports in the east of England, in Norwich, that have done a lot. There's a lot of disconsternation that Sheffield Airport's been closed. Leeds Bradford Airport isn't expanding the way that many people want it to.
Yeah.
And the case for Doncaster really goes back a long way. This was a major airbase for the RAF. It was Finningley. It's where the Vulcan used to be. Before we had Polaris in the submarines, our nuclear deterrent was in
V-Force,
flames. In the Vulcans, of course. Many people in and around Doncaster have fond memories of going to air shows. And since 2005, it's been a pretty successful civilian airport.
Yeah, and it's a structure that's worked really well in the United States, regional airports. They really have sort of stimulated local economies. You were saying that you could have got a flight from Doncaster across the pond to the US, of course, at one time. So what went wrong? Was it the lack of investment or the way that the airport was actually handled?
Well, I spoke to lots and lots of local people while we were making that film, and we're going to stick with this story, by the way. There's a huge strength of feeling. Mark Chadwick, who appeared in that film, he's a local mechanic. Doncaster born and bred, not really au fait with social media particularly, but he's got this Facebook group that's absolutely mushrooming as more and more people join. Now, the airport owner, they're not a regular air operator. They're not like a company that generally owns airports. They're called the Peel Group. And there's a lot of suspicion locally, which the Peel Group refute, and I reflected that in the film, that they simply want to run the airport at a loss, maybe not be completely open with the business case. Just a few years ago, the airport was saying it was going to go up to 4 million passengers prior to COVID. And regional airports are recovering now since COVID. Obviously, COVID whacked them. But Peel Group deny the idea that lots of locals have, that they think they can make more money gradually selling off this huge site for housing and science parks
for development,
rather than running it as an airport. But as an airport, it has huge positive knock-on effects for the rest of the region.
Yeah, because one reflects the runway is there, the terminal building is there, the axis is there.
Yeah.
So
the airspace is licensed to run a civilian airline. And I tell you what, Mark, something I learnt on this trip, funny, isn't it? We get out of the office in London, get on the road and we learn stuff. I learned that the airstrip at Doncaster, it isn't just any old airstrip, because when the Americans put the space shuttle Challenger up when we were lads, it needed another airport where it could land that wasn't in the States. A kind of safety runover airport. A long way from the States, but in the same northern hemisphere. So Doncaster airstrip was made longer and made much, much higher quality. So, in theory, Space Shuttle could land there.
Yeah.
And it's still of that standard. That's why it was so popular with the RAF.
Yeah, like Manston in Kent, where Concorde could actually land and take off. Just a bit of breaking news, get your reaction to this. We're just learning that Just Eat, the takeaway.com group, saying it plans to axe around 1,700 delivery driver jobs and 170 head office roles after a slowdown in takeaway demand. Now, we are our antennae are up for various problems in the economy, the cost of living crisis, whatever. What do you make of that? I mean, is it an indication yet again that we're not out of the woods?
OK, so, of course, during lockdown, the idea that you could punch something into your phone and somebody would turn up on a little motorbike or a pair of roller skates 20 minutes later with your dinner, it just took off. And among certainly more comfortably off households, there was an enormous expansion of the use of the likes of Just Eat. It became a very, very successful company. Two things are happening now, Mark. We'll never be the same post-lockdown, but working patterns are returning somewhat to normal. So, of course, there's going to be more working from home than there ever was prior to 2020, but not nearly as much as there was at the height of lockdown, and even during the year after lockdown. So that's happening. And also, I think, to order in your food, you know, watch a movie or something, that is a luxury. And I think people are now skimping on the luxuries. We're seeing it in the way supermarket purchases are happening, moving away from the more upmarket names like Waitrose and Sainsbury's and Tesco.
Lidl, Aldi doing better.
They still dominate the market, but the discounters like Lidl and Aldi are doing better. And I think this is the online version of that.
Right. I guess the other thing is, we should reflect, there's also been increased competition in this. You've got Uber Eats, you've got Deliveroo, they're all sort of looking for the same amount of business. So anyway, so 1,700 delivery jobs and 170 head office jobs going there. We'll get more reaction. And, of course, we'll keep on top of Doncaster and see what happens in terms of taking off eventually, hopefully.
I see what you did there. And, of course, interest rate decisions coming up tomorrow, the US Federal Reserve, and on Thursday, the Bank of England.
And your guess is perhaps
I reckon they will both hold. I reckon they will both not raise interest rates because of market jitters related to the scares we've had over various banks over the last couple of weeks.
Markets sort of, at the moment anyway, settled down a bit. Skittish, good word. See you later. Now, Ofsted have been urged by education unions to pause inspections at a school in Reading due to the head teacher's death there, Ruth Perry, having taken her own life while waiting for an Ofsted report that had downgraded her primary school from outstanding to inadequate. Well, joining us now on the show, Christina Cunliffe, who's a head teacher in Ascot. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Christine. And I think we can report also that a neighbouring school where they'd asked Ofsted not to come and make an inspection, that is taking place. Clearly, it's highlighting an issue for many heads.
I think there's always been a problem with Ofsted. I mean, before being in the independent sector, I was in the state sector, and I can actually remember one of the earliest ones back in 1994, and they actually put the fear of God in people. Now, you know, I do know that schools have got to be regulated like any other industry, but when it causes this sort of trauma, there is definitely something wrong and it needs to be reviewed.
Yeah, and clearly one has to measure schools in some way, but I know a lot of heads have expressed their frustration with the one word, as in inadequate, instead of actually maybe something a little more nuanced.
I think also you're looking at a 2-day snapshot of a school that works throughout the year. I mean, how can you really get to know what a school's like, especially with the current pressures that, you know, society and schools are facing at the moment? And one word doesn't tell you much. You know, it's got to be a little bit more, I would say, respectful.
And what of the people who are carrying out the inspections? I mean, you know, is it the fear that perhaps they're rather more bureaucratic than those who might have had a bit of time in the classroom?
Well, it could be. I mean, I can't, you know, offer too much on Ofsted, but, you know, I know, for example, the independent schools were inspected by people like myself, fellow heads. and we go in and support schools and look for the best and bring out the best in those schools to celebrate the actual excellent education that's going on in this country at the moment.
Yeah, and clearly there was a big discussion about league tables and exam results and so on. So are we still not really sure how we measure success in our education system?
I think, league tables don't tell the true picture anyway, because you're going to get schools who are selective, who are always going to appear at the top.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean they're doing any better than the schools that are non-selective. They don't tell a story as well. So there's got to be a huge review of how we inspect schools and how we judge schools.
And how would you like that to take place then? What would be the best option?
Well, I think peer review of schools is a really good thing. People who, like myself, are working on the ground floor, who can see where the good is, and if there are improvements to be made, we work together. Schools should work together to ensure that we're providing the best for children.
Right, so what, you'd be parachuted into another school?
Well, for example, ISI, who inspect independent schools, on a team, there will probably be normally people like myself. I do a couple every year, and I take 2 or 3 days at a time to go and, review other schools and be part of that inspection team. And it's very supportive, and I think Ofsted has got something that could learn, actually, from ISI.
OK, well, there we are. The challenges out there. We'll see how they react to that. But we'll let you get back to your classroom and see what's going on in the school. Thank you very much for joining us here on GB News. Thanks. More reaction, of course, to come to that. But let's update you now on the issue of the Windsor framework, Northern Ireland, of course, and more on the DUP's decision that they will not vote for the deal with the EU tomorrow. Just to remind you that that is going to the Commons tomorrow. Also, the ERG, European Research Group, and the chairman, Mark Francois, repeatedly declining to say earlier today how members of the Eurosceptic group would vote on that framework tomorrow. Members meeting first to discuss the matter further. Where does that leave Northern Ireland and Stormont? Well, let's ask our reporter Doogie Beattie, who's there for us. And Doogie, indications from the Prime Minister that they're going to press ahead with the vote on the framework. But if the DUP aren't part of that, of course, the whole question then, what happens to power sharing there?
Well, it is, and you've hit the nail on the head. Power sharing. And, of course, it's not only the DUP, the PUP, the Progressive Unionist Party, the TUV, the True Unionist Voice, the DUP, and, of course, the very liberal UUP that at best described this framework document as a stepping stone. None of them are sitting in power behind us. So all you have is nationalism and the Alliance Party, and the Alliance Party's voting record has them voting the majority of the time with nationalists. So the power sharing executive at that point, well, it'll not be up and running again, and it can't be because there's no sharing of power. Now, everybody would love to see these institutions behind us up and running, including unionism. You've got to remember, unionist parties are they're very much in favour of devolved government. And in fact, when border polls, the polls on border polls were taken, the best time that they were at their lowest was in 2011 to 2013, when the institutions behind us were actually up and running. But that's because there was power sharing and its true self, and now that has gone because of the protocol and now the framework document. When even the ERG are describing it as a deal once you get into, it'd be very hard legally to get out of. You have to wonder, are the Tory party looking at Rishi Sunak and asking the question, what sort of negotiations have you put forward? And in fact, at the start of the week, we had Argentina starting to growl about the Falklands once again. And are they looking at how this is being dealt with here and thinking, well, there might be room to push for us? So very much, really, everything up in the air still. Northern Ireland isn't any further on. Joe Biden's going to come here in April, just a few weeks' time, to celebrate 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement. And, of course, the power-sharing executives will not be up and running. And I think if Rishi Sunak tries to push this through, he may cause a lot of trouble in Northern Ireland that he shouldn't be doing. And wise words from those in unionism would say, stop and think a second before we go too far and can't come back. So really, these next few weeks, unionism do want devolved government, there's no doubt about it, but it is very much in their thinking not to go that far at this minute in time. And
have we got indications from the various parties as to what they... believe could be a way forward? So Geoffrey Donaldson, who we saw there, basically saying he does not believe the framework needs to be renegotiated with the EU. And certainly, as you've indicated, Rishi Sunak saying, that's not going to be the case. But Sammy Wilson for the DUP basically saying that the so-called Stormont break does not cut the mustard. So is there any room for manoeuvre on actually changing that mechanism of the break?
Well, there is. Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, Westminster is sovereign, and it changed the law. Article 6 of Article 8, of the Acts of Union, so it can actually bring them back. There's nothing stopping them doing that. That would calm unionist nerves at that point. Then we come to the break. The break is not really a break, because what happens is you've got to have 30 signatures, then it goes forward from here to Westminster, where it's examined by a committee, and then there's negotiation with Europe. The problem with that, of course, is that the laws that we're not allowed to negotiate are those around customs in particular, which still then holds us inside the EU. And as I was saying last week, the green lane is not really a green lane. If I was selling 10 cattle in Carlisle and only sold 8 of them and 2 of them had to come back, if you look at what Rishi Sunak was saying, there would be a green lane. And if you look at what the EU's saying, no, they'd be in the red lane. So there's lots of things there that aren't clearing up. If there was foot and mouth or, say, a pandemic, you'd never think inside on Monaghan on the border, would we be part of the EU or would we be part of the UK? And who's paying for the clean-up? And what law would we have to go to after that?
Yeah.
These are all problems that are sitting behind us here. And really and truly, when you look at it like that, you're amazed that the rest of the parties here, the likes of the Alliance Party, the SDLP, are not in with the unionists, examining this and saying, we want the best for our people. Let's see where we can make it better all round. And it should work at that point, but we've got to get there first.
Doogie, thank you for that. We'll see what happens in the vote in the Commons tomorrow, and, of course, what the reaction is in Stormont. I suspect we'll be speaking to you again tomorrow. For the moment, thank you very much indeed. Just to reiterate that we've got the Home Secretary still on her feet in the Commons with the reaction to that Met Police report. All the latest reaction coming up from Westminster. Stay with us here on GB News Live.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
It's 2 o'clock. A very good afternoon and welcome to GB News Live with me, Mark Longhurst. Coming up for you this afternoon, Partygate, the latest. Boris Johnson saying he did mislead the Commons, but no evidence it was intentional. We'll get the latest reaction ahead of his appearance in Parliament tomorrow. Where now for the Met after today's damning report finding misogyny, racism and homophobia. The Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, saying they're not institutional problems. But the report's author, Baroness Casey, says there needs to be a new approach. The Home Secretary telling the Commons it could take years. Reaction to come. And as ever, get in touch with your views, gbviews@gbnews.uk, and we'll reflect those shortly. But let's get the latest headlines now with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon from the GB Newsroom. Here are the headlines at 2:01. Boris Johnson has accepted he misled Parliament over Partygate, but maintains it wasn't intentional or reckless. Submitting his 52-page defence dossier to the Privileges Committee, the former Prime Minister said gatherings at Downing Street during lockdown should never have happened. He also says statements in the House of Commons were made in good faith. He's due to give evidence before MPs tomorrow. A damning report into Britain's largest police force has been described by the Home Secretary as very concerning. Baroness Louise Casey, who led a review, found the Met Police is institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. She says victims have been let down and that officers who abuse their power have shattered public trust. The report also found the Met's current ethics standards and disciplinary procedures have failed abysmally and is calling for a complete overhaul. Suella Braverman says she has every faith in Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley, who will be a catalyst for change, and vowed to hold officers and the Mayor of London to account.
There have been growing concerns around the performance of the Metropolitan Police and its ability to command the confidence and trust of Londoners. This follows a series of abhorrent cases of officers who betrayed the public's trust and hideously abused their powers. Today's report, commissioned by Sir Mark's predecessor, makes for very concerning reading. It's clear that there have been serious failures of culture, leadership and standards.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper says Labour is calling for an urgent overhaul with new mandatory national standards.
I am concerned that the Home Secretary's statement is dangerously complacent. Astonishingly, there is no new action set out in her response, simply words saying that the Met must change. This is a continuation of the hands-off Home Office response that Baroness Casey criticises in her report. It is a disgrace that there still are not mandatory requirements on vetting and training underpinned by law, that misconduct systems are still too weak.
Deputy Leader of Lambeth Council and Director of the charity Black Thrive, Dr Jackie Dyer, says discrimination is rampant.
The mistrust is in every atom of every black body in this city. We are traumatised by the harm that is being conducted rampantly and relentlessly by policing, which is so unaccountable. It's like the wild, wild west out there. You can do anything you like and it's okay. Well, it's not okay.
In other news, a group of Eurosceptic Conservative MPs has described parts of the Prime Minister's new Brexit deal with the EU as practically useless. The European Research Group commissioned lawyers to scrutinise the Windsor framework ahead of tomorrow's vote on the storm break element of the proposal. A spokesperson for Rishi Sunak says it's a good deal and is urging lawmakers to back it. But the ERG's chair, Marc Francois, says issues still need to be addressed.
EU law will still be supreme in Northern Ireland. The rights of its people under the 1800 Act of Union are not restored. The Green Lane is not really a green lane at all. The Stormont break is practically useless, and the framework itself has no exit other than through a highly complex legal process.
3 unions representing teachers are urging Ofsted to pause inspections of schools this week after a head teacher took her own life. Ruth Perry was the head at Caversham Primary School in Reading. She killed herself while awaiting the review, which gave the school the lowest possible rating. The inspection found the school to be good in every category, apart from leadership and management, where it was judged to be inadequate. Ruth's sister says her death was a direct result of the report. Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are beginning a second day of talks as part of the Chinese leader's state visit to Moscow. Discussions today are expected to be more formal. Yesterday, Putin welcomed his dear friend to the Kremlin, and the pair discussed China's peace plan for Ukraine. President Xi has invited Putin to visit China and called for regular meetings. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, over to Mark.
Tamsin, thank you very much indeed. So, Boris Johnson's much-anticipated partygate defence is out, with the former Prime Minister accepting that he had misled the House of Commons. But he went on to insist it wasn't intentional or reckless, a key phrase in terms of his defence. Let's cross to Westminster now and speak to our political reporter, Olivia Utley, because, Olivia, the day before he's even got to the Commons, it's starting to kick off. A certain Dominic Cummings now suggesting that the former Prime Minister had indulged in further misinformation in regards to his account about a number 10 garden party.
Yes, absolutely. It's already getting pretty unedifying, this row between the committee, Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, and we can certainly expect to see more of this animosity tomorrow. Dominic Cummings is essentially accusing the Prime Minister of lying, and Boris Johnson, in his dossier, disregards Dominic Cummings' information, calling him the discredited Dominic Cummings and saying that it is well known that Dominic Cummings bears animus towards me. So it's turned into a bit of a spat between these two. It is very, very important what Boris Johnson's advisers said, and Boris Johnson's advisers at the time, including Cummings, are saying, because Boris Johnson's defence, one of the strands of his defence, rests on the idea that his advisers were telling him that he could stand up in Parliament and say that he didn't knowingly break any rules. And he says that if he was given that advice and he relayed it in Parliament, then he's sorry, it was incorrect, but what could he possibly do? That was the advice he was given. He's a busy man. He was very busy during the pandemic. He was trying to run the country. He had to rely on his advisors to work out the nitty-gritty of the regulations. And it seems, well, Johnson claims that apart from Dominic Cummings, all of the evidence in his dossier from his advisors suggests that they were telling him that he could, in clean conscience, stand up in Parliament and say that he wasn't breaking any rules. So in this instance, what Dominic Cummings says really matters, and it might sway what the committee decides tomorrow.
Yeah, and he's got £220,000 of taxpayers' money to put towards a legal defence. He's got Lord Panic KC to represent him, a barrister, and the fact that there's going to be, 4 to 5 hours, perhaps, of grilling, and that will be televised tomorrow, which we shall follow. But just explain again to us why this is so important. I mean, could this actually end his political career if it goes against him?
Yes, potentially it could end his political career. So what will happen tomorrow is Boris Johnson will give his evidence to the committee. The committee will release their final report in the near future, and they will advise the House of Commons whether they should vote to have Boris Johnson suspended from the House. If they vote to suspend Boris Johnson by 10 days or more, and that's important, they could opt for a short suspension and then the matter would go no further. But if they opt to suspend him by 10 days or more, then that will automatically trigger a by-election in Boris Johnson's Uxbridge constituency. And if 10% of the constituency of Uxbridge decide that Boris Johnson should be deselected, then he loses his job as an MP in Parliament, where he loses the Conservative whip, and that is the end of Boris Johnson, as it were. Now, Boris Johnson's majority in Uxbridge is 7,000, so it wouldn't take much at all, just 10% of a not particularly conservative-leaning constituency. It wouldn't take that many people to see him gone. So a lot is going to hinge on what the committee decides tomorrow, then what the House of Commons decides. And this is very important too, because it could be that the House of Commons, we're already seeing quite a lot of Conservative MPs standing up and saying, well, no, I'm with Boris Johnson. I think this 60-page dossier exonerates him, essentially. Yes, they're Boris Johnson supporters, but, you know, we could see quite a lot of them saying something along those lines, and then the matter ends there. And Rishi Sunak has decided to give them a free vote. Well, that's going to be interesting too, because we know when the Owen Paterson Privileges Committee furore was taking place, Boris Johnson whipped his MPs to back Owen Paterson. Rishi Sunak wants to avoid the chaos that ensued after that. Owen Paterson's demise essentially brought down Boris Johnson. So MPs will be given a free vote. It's going to be really, really interesting to see where they all fall, whether they support Boris Johnson or whether they don't. And I think we can expect to see splits at a cabinet level. So we could see some cabinet ministers supporting him and some not. But yes, if it gets that 10-day suspension phase, then it seems, I would say, on probability, likely that Boris Johnson's career as an MP could be over.
Olivia, thank you for that. At a breezy Westminster, we'll see if it'll be quite as breezy in the committee meeting tomorrow, of course, with those proceedings televised. Thank you very much indeed. Just an interesting observation where Press Association picked up that Gary Lineker has issued a new tweet about folk who constantly tell fibs. This being released less than an hour after Boris Johnson's legal defence over Partygate was published. Press Association commenting that the former England striker tweeted, "When folk constantly tell fibs, it's really difficult to know when they're telling the truth. I imagine it's even a challenge for themselves." Mr Lineker not making it clear who he's referring to, but Twitter users apparently speculating that the post was indeed about Boris Johnson. And of course, this follows his various comments concerning the issue of illegal immigrants. No further indication from Mr Lineker about why he said that, but we shall see what the reaction is. Let's move on to this report now into the Metropolitan Police, which found institutional misogyny, homophobia and sexism rife in the force, commissioned indeed after the abduction and murder of Sarah Everard by that serving officer Wayne Couzens. Now, it details more stories of cover-ups, sexual assaults, with 12% of women in the Met itself saying that they themselves been harassed or attacked while at work. The Independent report's author Baroness Casey saying the force needed a complete overhaul. The Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, saying that they accepted the findings but rejecting the charge that these problems were institutional, as it was said. Well, joining us now is our national reporter Ellie Costello, who's been at Scotland Yard bringing reaction throughout the day, and the Home Secretary with a fairly comprehensive session in the Commons, having to go through all these various issues and reflecting it could take years to actually change the Met in reaction to this.
Yes, strong words this afternoon from Suella Braverman, standing up in the House of Commons and reflecting on the findings of this review. She said that the primary and political accountability, as Baroness Casey in her review makes clear, sits with the Mayor of London. And Suella Braverman went on to say that she would be holding the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London to account by measuring both of their progress. London Mayor Sadiq Khan has also said that he will be measuring the progress of the Metropolitan Police. That's another statement we've had from him this morning. But back to Suella Braverman in the Commons. Very interesting. She backed the Met Commissioner's refusal to accept that the Metropolitan is institutionally racist. And it does seem to be circling around that word institutionally, because the review found that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic. And it was that word of institutionally that Sir Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, took issue with. He says he'd like the term to be used systemic rather than institutionally. He wanted to be using a practical word, he said, and to have the focus on the good work of the many good Metropolitan Police officers that are working hard in the capital. But it seems as though Suella Braverman agrees. In the House of Commons, she said it's not a helpful term to use. It's an ambiguous, contested and politically charged term that is misused. So although both of them accept the findings of the report, neither of them want to use the term institutionally, which is a very interesting thing to find. Of course, this is in response to that 363-page report by Baroness Casey that found that sexism and homophobia was at the heart of the Metropolitan Police. Sir Mark Rowley has issued an apology to Londoners. He said it is ghastly and it generates a lot of emotions in him, including frustration, anger and embarrassment. But the fact that he has failed to use the word institutional has caused a lot of criticism here today outside New Scotland Yard. We've had black organisations and charities here saying, how are these changes going to be effective? How are these changes going to take place if the Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, cannot even accept that they are there in the first place? And that's what the Labour MP for Streatham has been talking to me about just a few moments ago. This is Belle Ribeiro Addy. She told me she wasn't surprised by the findings of this review.
There is nothing, unfortunately, surprising in the Casey review today. I mean, we've heard this over a number of different reports, and it definitely reflects the attitudes of my constituents. Lambeth is somewhere where we have the lowest trust and confidence in policing, and it's been very, very difficult over the past few years where we've seen more and more revelations about what has happened with Met Police officers. I really, really want to see change, but I find it difficult to believe that we're going to get there anytime soon if we do not call it out for what it is. Institutional racism, sexism and homophobia. We have to name it. If we don't name it, we clearly don't have a plan to tackle it. And I think that's fundamentally wrong.
Well, London Mayor Sadiq Khan has called it one of the darkest days in the Metropolitan Police's history. He says he wants to take on board all of the 16 recommendations that have been made in the review. That includes looking at the Parliamentary Protection Diplomatic Command Department. That is the department that Wayne Couzens, the murderer of Sarah Everard, that is the department in which he worked in. She said that should be disbanded in its current forms. She said firearms officers should be re-vetted. She suggested a dedicated women's protection service needs to be set up, and there also needs to be a fundamental reset of the stop and search policy in London. So those are just a few of the suggestions. There are 16 in total. They are not going to be quick to implement, and they're not necessarily going to be easy, but Baroness Casey says they're absolutely essential if the Metropolitan Police Service is going to survive. She says if they do not get to the bottom of this rotten culture in the next 5 years, it could be disbanded entirely.
Ellie, thank you very much for updating us there at New Scotland Yard. And let's speak now to Conservative London Assembly member Susan Hall, who's the chairman of the Police and Crime Committee. And Susan, I think I'm right in saying that both Baroness Casey and the Met Commissioner will appear before the committee tomorrow. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Tomorrow morning.
What will you be asking Sir Mark about this issue of whether it's institutional or systemic? Is it up to him to actually reject the findings of the report from Baroness Casey?
No, I don't think he's rejecting it. He's actually saying he accepts the findings. He doesn't like that particular word, and I actually understand that, because it means different things to different people. To some people, it means that everybody is racist. He fully accepts there are people within his organisation that are racist, and that he's clearly got to do something about. But to blanket everybody with institutional racism doesn't really help the ones that are so good working within the Met Police Force. And believe you me, there are plenty of them.
Yeah. Doesn't it go, though, to the heart of this issue of a cultural problem? As Baroness Casey described the Met, long on hubris, quite short on humility, they are completely in denial organisationally. Isn't it the case that perhaps, if there are good officers, they're not being allowed to have their voice heard?
Well, I think they will have their voice heard. I do have a great deal of faith in Sir Mark Rowley and his deputy, Dame Lynn Owens. I really do. It will take a while, and everybody's got to accept that. And the more he rummages around and manages to get rid of the ones that are causing issues, obviously the media will pick up on that.
Yeah.
And I think it'll almost look worse before it gets better. But I genuinely believe it will get better. I don't blame him for not wanting to go along with the word institutional. I don't blame him for that. But he has actually said this morning, I've seen him say it, he will accept the findings of Dame Casey's report.
How long, though, has he got to turn it round? Suella Braverman, as you know, has told the Commons earlier that the Met faces a long road to recovery. It may take years to address. I mean, is that acceptable?
Well, it's clearly going to be able to get the bad ones out. One of the main issues is that Samart Rowley can't sack officers. They have to go in front of a board, and very often the board lets them go, which is totally unacceptable. If you're running an organisation with, I think, around 45,000 people employed, you've got to have the ability to get rid of people that you don't think are any good. I believe there's 8,800, something like that, officers that are actually on restricted duties. That can't be right. There's lots of things that have got to happen, and I genuinely believe Sir Mark and Dame Lynn are the ones to take this on.
Yeah.
I think within 2 years we've got to see major changes.
OK. Yvette Cooper also in the Commons earlier making the additional point, no compulsory vetting procedures still, and therefore, you know, it's let the wrong people in. I mean, again, is this an issue that you think needs to be addressed pretty quickly?
Oh, that's got to be addressed very quickly. But we do have problems in recruiting at the moment. So all of that needs to be looked at. It certainly does. And when we're looking at people, we must be looking at Sadiq Khan as well, because he is the Police and Crime Commissioner. He seems to push everything to the government. But actually, this is Police and Crime Commissioners are responsible for the policing in their area. So he has also got to look at himself and think, how can he look at this in a different way?
Right, so could there be a bit of a political row brewing as well, then, in that case?
There's always political rows brewing, as you well know.
Okay.
You live
question,
on them.
Sorry.
but he does have to. We've got the Deputy Mayor for Policing coming tomorrow as well, and she will be asked some questions because she has oversight of this. It should never have got into this state. And some of the things that they're suggesting putting in now, a board to look at things every quarter, that was disbanded when Sadiq Khan came in. So hopefully that will be put back in again. And hopefully they will look at the model of the BCUs, which I have never, ever supported. I've thought that was always a very bad idea. It spreads policing too thin.
Susan Hall, Chair of the Police and Crime Committee, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. And, of course, we'll see what emerges in the committee meeting tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Derby has been announced as a location to host the headquarters of the new public sector body, Great British Railways. The Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, confirming that decision earlier after reports that the East Midlands city was successful in its bid. The unsuccessful locations, Birmingham, Crewe, Doncaster, and, of course, we heard about the problems with the airport earlier, Newcastle and York. Well, let's go live now to, yes, Derby Railway Station with our reporter Will Hollis there. And history on its side, perhaps, there, Will.
Yes, very much so, Mark. Now, if you've been watching the news in the last couple of days, you probably thought that the best news we're going to get around the railways was that Network Rail and RMT deal. But if you're here in the Midlands, in the East Midlands and in Derby, of course not. That's been top-trumped massively because this is a very big thing. Great British Railways, the HQ, will be coming to Derby, and that essentially means that Derby was chosen more favourably over all of those other places that you've listed. The Department for Transport says that particularly because of that railway history, the heritage that goes back around 200 or so years, right to the earliest steam trains, is one of the things that gave a real big tick in the box of Derby, as well as things like the applications levelling up agenda, the contribution to that, but also the contribution that it can give to other transport connections. Now, one of the organisations that is, of course, very happy is the local City Council, and Councillor Chris Poulter, the leader of Derby City Council, said, "We're absolutely thrilled that Derby has been selected to become the home of Great British Railways. This result is a testament to the hard work of our team alongside our key partners based here in Derby." There was a massive push towards cross-party support. 22 MPs from the East Midlands all supporting it, as well as the biggest organisations in this part of the country. But what is that HQ going to be used for? Now, Great British Railways ultimately is going to be the public body that aims to bring about reform in the railway industry. That's really what the government has been trying to do for a number of years. It's going to take on some of the roles that the Department for Transport already does. It's also going to be responsible for Network Rail. It's going to be absorbing that, so it'll be in charge of the infrastructure of the railways here in Britain, but mainly around reform, like things like contracts and timetabling, as well as fare pricing. That's going to be all under the hub based here in Derby. Now, the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, who's visiting Derby right now, in fact, you might even see him come out of the train station, he said that Great British Railways will put the passenger first, promoting collaboration and innovation across a joined-up, efficient and modern network. This is an announcement that has been delayed. The government says that they've made delays around announcing this, particularly because it had to get legislation through Parliament last year so that it could focus on things like the cost of living crisis. Right. Of course, anything that's worth doing, the government would quite happily delay. But this is a place where in the last year, in 2021, we saw the eastern leg of HS2 scrapped. That left a very bitter taste in the mouth of people that live in this region, whether it's politicians or business people. But today, that is a little bit of a sweetener coming in the form of Great British Railways HQ for Derby.
Yeah, but even the announcement's delayed. Oh, dear. Anyway, Will, thank you very much for updating us there. It is arriving at Derby at last. More coming up here on GB News Live will reflect the fact that President Putin's talking in Moscow. Is he wanting more military aid from China? Updating on that coming up in a moment.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Live. Let's take you to Moscow now, where the Chinese president is meeting Vladimir Putin with a very long table and indications that there will be at least 12 points or a 12-point peace proposal being discussed between the two sides. But clearly the feed has just been interrupted. But let's just actually reflect on a quite interesting assessment from NATO. This is coming in from Jens Stoltenberg saying that there are indications, he said in Brussels, that China was being asked for so-called lethal weapons or lethal aid by Moscow. No indication, said NATO, that was being provided by Xi Jinping, but of course they are locked in those talks in the Kremlin. Indications that elsewhere economic ties, because of course Russia, the source of oil for Beijing's huge economy, and trade as well, currently based around technology and supplies of particularly high-tech supplies to Moscow, but we'll update you as we get more. That bilateral meeting underway in Moscow at the moment. Now, more from Mark White about an Eritrean migrant who settled in Rwanda more than 17 years ago, who has told GB News he has no regrets about moving to the nation. Now, the migrant, who owns a chain of supermarkets in Kigali with his brother, had at one time been planning to come to, yes, the UK. Well, our Home and Security Editor Mark White sent this latest report from Kigali.
To its critics, Rwanda has a deeply flawed political leadership with a lamentable record on human rights. To others, including the British government, this is an intrinsically safe and prosperous country. The truth, as always, is more complex and not well served by simple stereotypes. This coffee shop on the outskirts of the capital, Kigali, was opened 4 years ago by a husband and wife from Yemen who fled the fighting there as refugees and eventually settled in Rwanda. They've gone on to create a thriving business.
When we just landed in Rwanda, in the first few days, we decided we will not leave this country. We've been in Malaysia. Malaysia was not like this clean or organized or safe.
When we just arrived here, people, they are so welcoming, they love expat, you know. We saw that this different.
This is one of Africa's most dynamic economies. All the more remarkable given the genocide here less than 3 decades ago, which left 800,000 dead and millions displaced. Pierre Nyambia's family fled Rwanda's civil war and eventually ended up in Canada. She's returned to be part of the regeneration, setting up a business that champions local arts and design. The fact so many here were displaced by the genocide has, she says, instilled a genuine compassion in many Rwandans for the plight of refugees.
It's definitely welcome because I think for us it's skill sets that are needed. And there are things that will help elevate a lot of the work that we're doing. I know for us as a fashion brand, we're always looking to collaborate with people from all over the world.
Rwanda's critics say its leaders care little for the plight of those displaced in neighbouring Congo, where it's accused of supporting rebel fighters there. Still, Rwanda is currently host to 140,000 refugees. The Eritrean owner of this Kigali supermarket chain arrived here 25 years ago after fleeing the fighting there. He was later joined by his brother, who decided to settle here rather than travel to study in the UK. Do you think people coming here, refugees sent here from the UK, do you think that they have a chance of making a good life for themselves, or will it be very difficult?
I don't think they will have any problem really, because this is a very, very peaceful country, a very clean, things are in order. Had the people been bad people, I wouldn't have lived here for such a long years, and then we wouldn't have been able to grow to this level where we are today.
It would be wrong to suggest Rwanda offers the same level of opportunities and personal freedoms as the UK. But from what I've seen, it's clear there is still plenty of potential for those who end up here to make a good life for themselves and certainly enjoy greater freedoms than the circumstances they say they're fleeing allow. This is a fast developing country. It's not all the way there yet and certainly needs to do more to meet Western standards on human rights. But the country's supporters say it's rapidly moving in the right direction. Mark White, GB News in the Rwandan capital, Kigali.
Mark White updating us with another exclusive report here on GB News. Coming up, more reaction, of course, to that Metropolitan Police report. Suella Braverman being accused by Labour of delivering a dangerously complacent response. We're expecting to hear from Keir Starmer shortly. Have that for you live. But first, let's get update on the headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thanks very much. Here are the headlines at 2:34. Well, let's just start with some breaking news. And counter-terrorism police are involved in an investigation into an attack outside a mosque in Birmingham yesterday. West Midlands police say the man suffered burns to his face after his jacket was set alight as he walked home. One person has been arrested on attempted murder, and officers are studying CCTV video and footage on social media. That news just in. Boris Johnson has accepted he misled Parliament over partygate, but maintains it wasn't intentional or reckless. Submitting his 52-page defence dossier to the Privileges Committee, the former Prime Minister said gatherings at Downing Street during lockdown should never have happened. He also says statements in the House of Commons were made in good faith. He's due to give evidence before MPs tomorrow. A damning report into Britain's largest police force has been described by the Home Secretary as very concerning. It found the Met Police is institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. Baroness Louise Casey, who led the review, says victims have been let down and officers who abuse their power have shattered public trust. Home Secretary Suella Braverman says she has every faith the newly appointed Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, will be a catalyst for change. Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has called today one of the darkest days in the service. A group of Eurosceptic Conservative MPs has described parts of the Prime Minister's new Brexit deal with the EU as practically useless. The European Research Group commissioned lawyers to scrutinise the Windsor framework ahead of tomorrow's vote on the Stormont break element of the proposal. Food delivery company Just Eat has announced it's going to cut 1,700 jobs. That's to improve efficiency and reduce costs. It comes after a 9% slump in takeaway orders last year as people returned to pubs and restaurants after the COVID pandemic. Just Eat says affected staff will be given 6 weeks' notice with pay. TV, online, radio and on TuneIn, this is GB News.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I have walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back to GB News Live. Let's bring you more reaction now to this coruscating report on the Met Police from Baroness Casey. We've heard reaction already in the House of Commons from Yvette Cooper, there, the Shadow Home Secretary, who said the Home Secretary, in a statement, had been dangerously complacent. She's actually now talking a little more ahead of Sir Keir Starmer, giving his reaction. Let's just have a listen to what she's got to say.
In this area, as someone who has worked so closely on the overhaul of policing in Northern Ireland, as someone who's seen close at hand the kinds of leadership, strength and determination that are needed to restore confidence in a police force, and also who knows what can be done. Someone who's worked so closely with the police to prosecute some of the most dangerous criminals and terrorists, and has set such clear standards, and made clear that our response to Baroness Casey's report is part of our mission, the crime mission that Keir has set for the Labour Party and the next Labour government to keep Britain's streets safe. To introduce Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party.
Thank you, Yvette, and thank you for coming this afternoon. This week, I will announce details of Labour's national mission on crime, one of the 5 missions to give Britain its future back. These missions are about long-term plans to tackle long-term problems. And for those on the receiving end, there's no problem that has such a profound daily impact on their life as crime. From the antisocial behaviour that blights too many neighbourhoods and town centres, to the knife crime that is rising again, and the violence against women and girls that is shamefully high. So, in light of the shocking report by Baroness Casey today, I want to bring forward the announcement of part of that mission. And today I can announce that part of our crime mission will be to raise confidence in every police force to its highest level. Now, I know this will be difficult, but like our other missions, it is ambitious, serious and measurable. Every day across our country, we know brave police officers put their safety on the line to protect us all, risking their safety for ours. I know that because in my role as Director of Public Prosecutions, I worked with many of them to bring criminals to justice. We owe them our thanks. But we also have to face the reality that public confidence in policing has been shaken to its core in recent years by the hollowing out of neighbourhood policing, the collapse in the charge and prosecution rates, the delays in bringing criminals to justice, and, as we've seen today, evidence of serious failures on standards, including with the Met, the failure to root out police officers who themselves had committed the most terrible and unthinkable crimes. There will be police forces outside of London who might shrug their shoulders and say, this isn't us. But I've worked in criminal justice for decades, and I say to them, wake up. The findings in the Casey report are a warning for every police force. Confidence must be restored. Policing by consent depends on trust. And when that breaks down, policing becomes harder and crime thrives. Of course, there's a special focus today on the Metropolitan Police following the devastating report. Louise Casey catalogues in grim detail the culture, attitudes and practices of a police force that's lost its way. She pulls no punches in exposing a police force where poor management and basic lack of workforce planning have undermined the effectiveness of the force. Predatory and unacceptable behaviour has been allowed to flourish. Londoners let down with the huge loss of neighbourhood policing. Public protection failures that have put women and girls at greater risk. Across the force she found institutional racism, institutional misogyny and institutional homophobia. Page after page, the report provides both a detailed diagnosis of what's gone wrong and a blueprint for radical reform. The strength of its findings require an immediate and urgent response. Without that, policing cannot be restored and confidence in policing cannot be restored, the fight against crime will be weakened and people will continue to feel let down and fearful. A government that I lead would accept the findings in the report in full. We would work not just with the Met, but with policing institutions and forces across the country to ensure that deep reforms and changes are made. The new Met Commissioner, Mark Rowley, has our support in the work that he has now begun to turn around. But he must go further and faster, and he will have our support in doing that. I know that there are officers right across the Met who are desperate to see those improvements put into place and action taken to rebuild the confidence of Londoners. But mark my words, I will be relentless in demanding progress and change. The reforms needed will be, as the report suggests, on a par with the transformation of the Royal Ulster Constabulary to the Police Service of Northern Ireland. And note that word, service. Having played my part in that transformation in Northern Ireland, I know how serious a job it is to make that sort of deep cultural change to an institution. It requires extraordinary leadership, an iron will to make real change. It means being ruthless on weeding out those who will not change or are changing too slowly. It means tough disciplinary standards, swift action on those who continue to act against the new values of the organisation, a proper partnership between government and the police service to get the job done. And above all, it means changing the police from a force to a service, with public service values at its heart. From standing above communities to standing with them. That is the route to radical change, and it needs a total commitment from the police to achieve it. That's why I will expect radical change in the Met. No excuses. London is a diverse city. That is its beauty. But if we can get Catholics to serve in Northern Ireland, reach out across communities there, then I will not accept any special pleading that the Met cannot represent modern London. But I have to say, you cannot separate the failings laid out in black and white today from the political choices that have led us here. The report makes clear there's been a hands-off approach to policing since 2011. This approach has been accompanied by haphazard cuts, people feeling that law enforcement's effectively been withdrawn from swathes of the country. Accountability has been destroyed, progress halted, and then slammed into reverse. After 13 years of Tory government, policing is yet another public service that is collapsing, no longer serving those who rely on it, sacrificed to a Tory hands-off ideology that has failed. And until we change course, we will carry on down this path of decline. Successive Conservative Prime Ministers have diminished the fight against crime and done nothing to reform the police. In short, they've been negligent. It remains extraordinary that even now, after the terrible examples of violence against women from police officers, there are no mandatory national rules for police forces on vetting. It's left to 43 different police forces to do their own thing. I would put an end to this situation. And in Labour's first term, we would bring in national standards for all police forces to include mandatory vetting, training and disciplinary procedures. Bring in stronger accountability regimes to turn around failing forces. Rebuild neighbourhood policing with 13,000 more police. Get specialist 999 call handlers trained in domestic violence in every police control room. Set up dedicated specialist rape units in every police force in the country. But throughout my whole career, I've seen reports come and go. Moments like this missed. The biggest danger today is that this just becomes another report, rather than the beginning of real, lasting change. It cannot be an occasion for even more words and too little action. There needs to be a reckoning, and there needs to be change. A change for Londoners, a change for those good police officers who are fed up of being let down by a negligent government, and change for the public who deserve a police service that they can have confidence in. The British policing model, which we should cherish, began here in London nearly 200 years ago. Unlike most forces across the world, our police are guardians, not guards, rooted in the powerful tradition of policing by consent, where the police are the public and the public are the police. But that vital tradition is in peril. And without the biggest overhaul in policing since the force began, I fear for its future. We must rebuild confidence. Today is a day for action. Thank you very much. I will now take, I think we've got a number of questions from the media. I've got a list, so I hope this is going to work. First of all, I have David from the BBC.
Thank you.
David.
Thank you very much, Sir Keir. How long, if you were Prime Minister, would you be giving the Met Police Commissioner to turn this around? And you mentioned mandatory vetting standards for police officers across all forces. Are there any other significant police reforms we can expect to be in the next Labour manifesto? And a quick question, if I may, on another topic. Boris Johnson has today said he didn't recklessly or intentionally mislead MPs. Do you buy that?
Look, I mean, on the action that needs to be taken straight away. Mark Rowley has started on that action, and I'm pleased that he has, and I support him in that, but he needs to go further and faster. This has to be the radical change that we saw, or the likes of which we saw in Northern Ireland with the Royal Ulster Constabulary as it transformed to the police service of Northern Ireland. So, you know, not tinkering around the edges, but root and branch change, changing behaviour, changing culture and changing confidence in policing. That is difficult. That's why I say it requires extraordinary leadership, an iron grip and a government that is absolutely committed to it. On mandatory vetting, I hope that you share my shock that there aren't national standards on vetting. How can it possibly be right to have a different stand on vetting for police officers in different parts of the country? It is not possible to defend that failure. And so we need to turn that around as quickly and as swiftly as possible, as we do disciplinary procedures and standards, and you know, behaviour and leadership across the Met. On your question in relation to Boris Johnson, look, I understand that his evidence has gone into the, well, defence evidence has gone into the public domain today. To be honest, I haven't seen it yet, and it'll be for the committee tomorrow, obviously, to start their work at 2 o'clock. Thank you, David. Libby.
Just following up on the issue of national vetting, I mean, you say that other forces have problems, but do you think that the Met has unique problems, and can it actually survive in its current form? Does it need to be broken up into smaller structures, in your view? And a second question also on the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. You may not have had time to look at his evidence, but do you think he has a case that he didn't intentionally mislead the House?
Look, on the first thing I'd say about other forces is, as I said in the short address earlier, it is a big mistake for other forces to shrug their shoulders and to assume that this is an issue that is unique to the Met and doesn't touch on their behaviours, their leadership and their culture. A big mistake, and I wouldn't accept that from them as Prime Minister if we have a Labour government. And therefore the change that's being proposed today has to include change across policing, and that's what our mission, you know, we've got 5 missions for an incoming Labour government. One of them is safe streets, and that will require change on policing across the whole country, not just a reaction to this report, though of course it has to be a reaction to this report. We need change in the Met. I don't think breaking up into smaller units is the change we need. And I also feel that simply moving around the bits of the Met is not a proper answer to the behavioural and cultural change that you need. I saw this. I worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years with the police service there, and they brought about behavioural change and instilled confidence in policing by doing a root and branch change from top to bottom, and that's the sort of extent of the change that we need. On Johnson, look, I mean, the committee's going to have to do their work tomorrow. He will start his evidence at 2 o'clock, and I'm just going to have to let them get on with it. Thank you, Libby. Victoria from Sky.
Was it a mistake to say that you fully supported the former Met Police Commissioner Cressida Dick 18 months ago? And just very briefly, if I may, the Prime Minister says he'll be giving his MPs a free vote on any sanctions imposed on Boris Johnson by the Privileged Committee. Will you be whipping Labour MPs on this issue, or will they get a free vote?
Well, just taking the first issue on Cressida Dick. Look, yes, I had confidence in Cressida because I wanted her to start the work turning this around. Obviously, there came a point at which the Mayor lost confidence in her, which is why, in the end, she resigned. But what I would say, as a more general response to this, because I think it's a really important point, is that I've seen no end of serious reviews and reports into things that have gone wrong in criminal justice, and the instinct to simply say, if one head rolls, then that's the problem solved, is always there, and it's always wrong. Because you go for one person, you take them out, right or wrong, and assume that that's all the change you need. What's laid out in this report is so deep and so challenging that, in my view, it's a mistake to simply say one individual is the problem. It's a bit like, you know, the whole, which is why I think the government's response has not been adequate enough, because they're not really accepting the findings in full. Therefore, I don't think they'll actually do the structural change that's needed, because they're still in the sort of bad apples theory rather than accepting the institutional nature of this. Look, in relation to the Johnson, I mean, we haven't, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. He hasn't begun his evidence yet. The committee hasn't come to a finding yet or a recommendation yet. When they do, we'll make a decision about where we go from them. But I'm going to just, I do at this stage want the committee just to get on with their work, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you, Victoria. Charlotte from LBC.
Thank you. Baroness Casey says the Met should be disbanded if change isn't achieved in 2 years. If in 2 years' time a Labour government was in power, the Met hasn't done enough, would you then push that button to action that root and branch change, like the transformation of the Royal Ulster Constabulary? And do you think Baroness Casey was wrong to stop short of recommending that change today, now?
No, I don't think she's wrong about that. I do think that this is, I was going to say the opportunity, the duty of the Met now to go through as significant a change as the RUC did in transforming the police service of Northern Ireland. That is big change. It requires strong leadership, but it requires leadership which has the shoulder of the government behind it. And this is why I think the hands-off approach of the government since 2011 have been so wrong. They've sat it out. They've been complacent. They've assumed it's not their responsibility to hold the police to account and to take responsibility for the change. We haven't had meaningful police reform for a very, very long time, and you know, that's part of the picture that Louise Casey paints in relation to this. But you know, if there's a Labour government at the next election, it will, you know, not only with the Met, but across the country, it will be a national mission. We've only got 5 national missions. One of them is on crime, on making our streets safe. And so I will be unrelenting in this. I mean, you know, my whole life has been about criminal justice, prosecuting as head of the Crown Prosecution Service for 5 years. So I don't need any persuading that criminal justice matters. I don't need any persuading on the impact that crime has, whether it's antisocial behaviour, whether it's knife crime, whether it's terrorism, on the lives of so many working people across the country. And I will be absolutely unrelenting on this, as I have been in the past. Thank you. Charles from the Telegraph.
Hi.
And I'm going to, Yvette, I must bring you in as well, please.
Okay. On professionalism standards, the Police Foundation review, which was chaired by Michael Barber, recommended that police should be held on a licence for 5 years, and then that every 5 years there would be a review in order to determine whether they were sufficiently effective and good at their job in order to continue as a police officer. Do you believe that that should be introduced? Secondly, You talk about differential standards around the whole of the country with 43 police forces. Is it time to finally bite the bullet and amalgamate police forces in order to create something that is more fit for purpose in the modern world, where crime is spread across different areas?
Yeah, let me answer both of those and then bring Yvette in. I'm not currently persuaded that the police licence scheme is necessary, because I think that the vetting and the continual performance review and accountability within the police, if done properly, should serve that purpose. And I can't emphasise enough how important the vetting is. I have not yet heard anyone make a persuasive argument that it's sensible to have a different standard for entry into the police in Manchester than you've got in London, Swindon as you've got in Swansea. I mean, it just beggars belief that anybody could defend that. But I think that's what needs to be put in place. On the 43 forces, I do think that there's more we could do at a national level. Operational independence for the police in relation to their operations is very, very important. But national standards when it comes to things like vetting are also important. So, in a sense, if you've got national standards, it doesn't matter how many police forces you've got, but you've got to have national standards. And that's not just on vetting, it's obviously on disciplinary procedures as well. In fact, can I bring you on?
Yes, welcome along everybody. Patrick Christie's here with you on GB News 3 until 6 p.m. We've just heard from Keir Starmer on the Met there. I'll return to that in a second. But here's what's coming up this hour. So, Boris Johnson is clinging on for his political life. He's released his defence into the old partygate